In the spring of 1639, in a house in Prague, a man sat down to write a letter about a book he could not read. His name was Georg Berish. He was an alchemist, and a careful one, and the book had sat in his library for years, taking up space he would write uselessly. He had studied it the way you might study a locked door, patiently from every angle, and to no effect at all. It was filled, cover to cover, with a flowing script in an alphabet he had never seen, wrapped around drawings of plants that grew nowhere on Earth. He had come to think of it as a kind of riddle. A certain riddle of the Sphinx, he called it. So he did what a reasonable man in 1639 might do. He wrote to the one person in Europe who claimed he could read anything, Athanasius Kircher, the Jesuit polymath in Rome, who had announced to great acclaim that he had at last decoded the hieroglyphs of ancient Egypt. Berish copied out a few lines by hand, sent them south, and waited for the master to work. Kircher was wrong about the hieroglyphs, as it happens, spectacularly, completely wrong, though no one would know it for another 200 years. And Kircher never solved Berish's riddle either. Neither has anyone else. Nearly 4 centuries have passed since that letter. The book now rests in a climate-controlled vault at Yale University, cataloged in the dry language of libraries as Voynich Manuscript 408. Its pages have been photographed at a resolution its makers could not have dreamed of. It has been studied by the men and women who broke the great military ciphers of the 20th century. It has been fed to computers and, more recently, to artificial minds. And still, after all of that, not one sentence of it has ever been read. There are only 3 possibilities. And the strange thing, the thing that has kept serious people awake for 100 years, is that we cannot rule any of them out. Either the book is written in a real language, hidden behind a code no one has managed to break, or it is written in a language that never existed anywhere but in the mind of the person who made it. Or it says nothing at all, an elaborate, beautiful hoax built to look like meaning and to hold none. Tonight, we're going to walk through all 3 of those doors. We're going to meet the people who were certain they had the answer. A famous professor, the codebreakers of 2 world wars, the machines of our own age, and we're going to watch one by one as each of them turns out to be wrong. But the book does not begin for us in the 15th century, when its pages were made. It begins on a winter's day in 1912, when a bookseller with a secret walked into a room full of forgotten manuscripts and carried out the one that would outlast him. He was not born Wilfred Voynich. He was born Michał Habdank Voynich in 1865 in a town called Telsze on the western edge of the Russian Empire, the son of minor Polish nobility trained as a chemist. But chemistry was not what pulled at him. Politics did. As a young man, he fell in with a revolutionary movement, and at 21 he was arrested for it, and the empire did with him what the empire did. It sent him east to Siberia, to a settlement near Irkutsk at the far cold end of the world. He did not stay. In 1890 he escaped and made his way across the whole width of Russia and most of Europe, to London, arriving, the story goes, with almost nothing to his name. And there he became someone else. Wilfred Michael Voynich, British subject, antiquarian bookseller. Within a decade, he was one of the most respected dealers of rare books and manuscripts in the world. He did not do it alone. His wife, Ethel, born Ethel Lillian Boole, daughter of the mathematician George Boole, whose logic would one day become the language of computers, was a formidable figure in her own right, the author of a novel called The Gadfly that would go on to sell millions of copies in the Soviet Union. They were two people who had each already lived several lives before the one that would come to define them both. That life began, as far as we are concerned, in 1912. Voynich was doing what he did best, hunting. Somewhere in Italy, a collection of old manuscripts had come quietly onto the market, and Voynich acquired a portion of it, around 30 volumes. Most were the sort of thing a learned dealer would expect: devotional texts, illuminated hours, the ordinary treasures of the trade. But one of them was not like the others. It was small, bound in soft and shapeless vellum, thick as a brick and light in the hand. A book that had plainly been used, its pages worn soft by generations of thumbs. He opened it, and for the first time in a long and learned life spent among the writings of dead men, Wilfred Voynich could not read a single word. 9 years later, in 1921, he stood before the College of Physicians in Philadelphia and told them how he had found it. His words were these: "For many decades, these volumes had lain buried in the chests in which I found them, in an ancient castle in southern Europe." He would not say which castle. He hoped one day to buy the rest of the collection, he explained, and so its location would remain his secret. It was a marvelous story. The exile who became a bookseller, the forgotten chests, the ancient castle in the south, the book that no one on earth could read. It had everything. It was also, we now know, largely untrue. The real account is quieter and in its own way stranger. Voynich did not stumble upon the collection in the castle. He was invited to buy it, and the party doing the selling was the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, and the reason for all the secrecy had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with property. When the newly unified Italian state seized Rome in 1870, it began confiscating the libraries of the religious orders, the great Jesuit college library among them, taken in 1873. What the Jesuits could hide, they hid, moving books out to private villas in the hills near Rome. And by 1912, in need of money, they began quietly selling some of it, most to the Vatican, and a smaller lot, around 30 manuscripts, to a discreet and well-regarded dealer named Voynich, through an English Jesuit go-between called Father Joseph Strickland. Voynich agreed to keep the whole thing secret, for a simple reason: the Italian state still regarded those books as its own to seize. The chests and the ancient castle were a fiction he was required to tell. We know this, in part, because of a letter. Ethel Voynich sealed an account of the purchase and left instructions that it be opened only after her death. When it was, it read in her plain hand that the manuscript was the property of the Vatican, that it was bought in or about 1911, and that the intermediary was allowed to buy after giving a promise of secrecy. The widow, at the end of her life, quietly correcting the myth her husband had spent his own life telling. Even the place has slipped its moorings. For decades, the story named a specific building, the Via Mondragone, a Jesuit villa above the town of Frascati. But Voynich himself never named it. That detail was added 30 years after his death, the best guess of a later owner, and the archives now point somewhere else entirely, a villa at Castel Gandolfo, in the hills where the popes have taken their summers for 400 years. We are not certain anymore, even of the where. And this is the first thing to understand about the Voynich manuscript. Before we have read a word of it, before we have turned a single one of its impossible pages, it comes to us already wrapped in a story that isn't quite true. Not a lie, exactly. A necessary fiction. A cover laid over a quiet transaction to protect it, which is a fitting way for this particular book to arrive, because every single person who has held it since has done the very same thing. They have looked into its silence, and they have told a story to fill it. We are about to meet a great many of them, but before we meet any of them, before the professor with his microscope, before the codebreakers, before the machines, we should meet the book. The stories told about this manuscript have a way of coming apart under a steady look. We have watched one do so already. The object is different. It can be weighed, measured, sampled, and made to answer. And nearly everything we truly know about this book, as opposed to everything that has merely been said about it, comes from its skin and its ink. Start with what it feels like in the hand. It is small. It is about 9 inches tall, 6 inches wide, 2 inches thick, the proportions of a pocket Bible, a fat little block of a thing, lighter than it looks. Nothing about it is grand. The cover is plain, limp vellum, undecorated, and not even original. It was put on by some later owner 3 or 4 centuries after the pages were made. And the pages themselves are soft. Lisa Fagan Davis, one of the leading medieval manuscript scholars in America, describes the feel of the vellum precisely soft, a texture found in books that have been heavily thumbed. Hold on to that, because it is the first real fact the book volunteers. This is not a treasure that sat untouched on a shelf for 5 centuries. Grand display manuscripts, the gilded books of hours made for princes, stay crisp because nobody actually reads them. This book was handled, opened flat, paged through, consulted over and over like a cookbook or a field guide. Whatever it says, a long chain of somebody's once found it worth coming back to. It is a working manual, which makes its silence, if anything, stranger. The pages are vellum, calfskin, and we can say so with unusual confidence because in 2014, the skins were subjected to protein analysis at the University of York. Calf, not sheep or goat, and not one calf. A book this size took the skins of at least 14 or 15 animals. Vellum was never cheap. Someone, at the start of the 15th century, committed a small herd of cattle to this project before a single word was written. Whatever this book is, it was not an idle doodle. It was funded. Count the pages, and a darker fact emerges. 102 leaves survive, roughly 240 pages. Once you allow for the plates that unfold, 5 that open out double, 3 triple, 1 quadruple, and 1 enormous sheet that opens into 6 panels, the largest drawing in the book, which we will stand in front of shortly. But the leaves carry numbers, small numerals in the top corner, added not by the makers but by some owner in the 16th century trying to impose order on a thing he could not read. And those numbers run to 116. At least 14 leaves, some 28 pages, are gone, not crumbled away. Cut out. Removed by someone at some time for reasons no one knows. One of those missing leaves, as we are about to see, took 2 signs of the zodiac with it. For nearly a century after Wilfrid Voynich carried the book out of Italy, its age was a matter of argument. Voynich himself billed it as far older than it is for reasons we will get to. The argument was settled, most of it, in 2009. An Austrian television documentary put up the money, Yale gave permission, and a physicist named Greg Hodgins of the Accelerator Mass Spectrometry Laboratory at the University of Arizona sat down with the manuscript and a scalpel. His own account is disarmingly plain. I sat down with the Voynich Manuscript on a desk in front of me and delicately dissected a piece of parchment from the edge of a page with a scalpel. 4 samples in all, each about the size of a grain of rice, taken from the margins of 4 different leaves, folios 8, 26, 47, and 68. pages the conservators were certain had never been patched or repaired. The result came back at 95% confidence. The calves whose skins became this book died between 1404 and 1438. The early 15th century, older by as much as 100 years than most scholars had assumed. And the 4 samples from 4 different animals from 4 separate parts of the book clustered tightly together within a couple of decades of one another. One batch of skins from one moment in time. Remember that clustering? It matters because the date on its own is a killer of theories. Roger Bacon, the 13th century English friar whose name Voynich himself attached to the book, died in 1292, more than a century before those calves were born. He did not write it. John Dee and Edward Kelly, the Elizabethan occultists of a later and more romantic theory, lived a century and a half after the vellum was made. They could conceivably have handled the book, but they did not originate it. And Wilfrid Voynich, whom some have accused of forging the whole thing, could not have manufactured authentic early 15th century calfskin in 1912. But here we must be exact, more exact than most tellings bother to be. Radiocarbon dating measures when the animal died. It dates the skin. It does not and cannot date the ink sitting on top of the skin. Hodgins says so himself. He would love to date the inks directly, but they lie on the surface only in trace amounts, and separating their carbon from the parchment beneath is, in his words, currently beyond our abilities. Which means that in principle, a much later forger could have found a stock of blank 15th century vellum and written on it. The carbon date alone cannot close that door. What weighs against it is everything else. 14 matched skins from one narrow window of years is an odd thing for a forger to have lying around. And then there is the ink itself. The ink was analyzed by Macron Associates, a forensic microscopy firm in Illinois, commissioned for the same 2009 documentary. Their finding: iron gall ink, the most ordinary ink of the medieval world, the everyday brown-black of contracts and sermons and ledgers made from oak galls and iron salts. The text and the drawings were executed, in all probability, in the same ink, one campaign, words and pictures together. The page numbers and the gathering marks, meanwhile, are in different inks entirely. Later hands, later owners, numbering a book they could not read. The paints tell the same story as the soft vellum. Blue ground from azurite, greens from common copper compounds, a red-brown from ochre, from earth, white from egg white mixed with chalk, and a yellow so cheap, so organic, that it has faded out of the book entirely, leaving ghosts where it used to sit. The analysis found nothing precious in these pages, no gold, no costly ultramarine, nothing that announced wealth. Whoever made this book made it properly and made it plain. A tool, not a jewel. One more thing about that analysis, and this series intends to insist on it, because this is precisely where careful history and comfortable legend part ways. You will read, in many accounts, that the Macron report proved the ink was applied soon after the vellum was made. It did not. No such statement appears in the report. What it actually found is narrower and honest. Nothing in the inks or pigments is inconsistent with the early 15th century, and nothing in them is modern. That is a real finding, and a damaging one for any theory of modern forgery. But it is not proof that the writing is as old as the skin. The difference between those two sentences is the difference between what we know and what we would like to know. Keep it in view. This whole story runs on it. Then, in 2020, Lisa Fagan Davis. she of the heavily thumbed vellum, studied the handwriting itself, hand by hand, across the entire book. The romantic image of the Voynich Manuscript has always been a lone figure at a desk, one obsessive, one hermit, one genius, filling page after page in a private script. Davis found five distinct scribal hands, each with its own habits of stroke and form, and dividing the book's text, strangest of all, into two statistical dialects that no single scribe ever crosses. We will come back to those two dialects. They are among the deepest constraints on any would-be solution. But hold the headline. 5 writers sharing one system on one matched batch of vellum. That is not a madman in an attic. That is a team. A workshop. An organized undertaking with materials bought in bulk and the labor divided. So this is the object, stripped of its legend. A plain, sturdy, well-made, well-used handbook from the early 1400s. Capskin, workaday ink, cheap paint, 5 careful hands. Thumbed soft by its readers. Mutilated by its owners. Renumbered, rebound, incomplete. Everything about it says function. Everything about it insists that it was made to be used, and it was. Which leaves only the question of what, in heaven's name, it was used for. And for that, there is nothing left to do but open it. So, we open it. The first page, folio 1, recto, in the dry language of librarians, and the book begins as it means to go on, with a plant that does not exist. A tall, dark stem, sprawling leaves, roots like nothing that grows in the ground. In the margins, faint scribbles left by later readers. At the foot of the page, a scrubbed-out smudge that will matter a great deal later in our story. But before we set out, one warning about the map. The tour we are about to take is a tour of pictures, because the pictures are all we have. Every section name you are about to hear, the herbal, the astronomical, the bathing section, the recipes, is a modern nickname, a guess hung on the images by frustrated readers. The book has never told anyone what it is actually about. We are describing the wallpaper of a house whose rooms we cannot enter. The first section is by far the largest, folios 1 through 66, more than 120 pages, half the book. The formula barely varies. One large plant to a page, drawn whole, root to flower, with the unreadable script pooling and flowing around it, fitted into whatever space the drawing left, as if the plant came first and the words came after. Page after page after page of this, about 113 plants in all. At arm's length, it looks exactly like something medieval Europe produced in quantity. An herbal, a picture book of useful plants for physicians and apothecaries. The genre was everywhere. That, presumably, is what its first readers took it for. Then you look closer, and botany fails. Researchers have spent over a century trying to put names to these plants, and they have named almost none of them. What grows on these pages are composites, the leaves of one species on the stem of another, crowned with flowers belonging to nothing at all. And there is a deeper problem. Medieval herbals copied one another, the same plants in the same poses, handed down from book to book across the centuries, a family tree of images that scholars can trace like a pedigree. These drawings copy nothing. They match no known herbal. They descend from nothing that survives, and nothing that survives descends from them. Whoever drew them was not copying. Whoever drew them was inventing, or working from a garden no one else has ever seen. And then there are the roots. On the page in front of us, folio 25, verso, the back of the leaf. A modest, feathery plant stands above its root system, and down among the roots there is a dragon. A small one, drawn almost cheerfully, jaws closed on one of the lower leaves. Turn on, and it keeps happening. Folio 49, snakes wound through the roots. Folios 34, 46, 90, the roots themselves drawn as animals, coiled, clawed, faintly watchful. Is it ornament? A memory device? The way medieval teachers hung pictures on ideas to make them stick? A code? A private joke 600 years past its punchline? And on folio 66, in the margin, something rarer and colder, a human figure, stretched out and still, which readers have long taken for a dead or dying man. Nobody knows why he is there. Nobody knows why any of it is there. One page in this section has caused more trouble than the rest of them combined. Folio 93 carries a plant with a great round flower head, and to a modern eye it looks, at first glance, like a sunflower. The trouble is that sunflowers are American. They did not exist in Europe before the voyages of Columbus. If this is a sunflower, the pages were painted after 1492. The radiocarbon result is beside the point, and everything we established in the last chapter is in ruins. A small school of researchers has argued exactly that. Yale disputes it, and so does nearly every specialist in the field. The identification is contested. It stands at least half a century after the dated vellum, and the mainstream reading is that this is simply one more composite. One more almost. One more almost. But the page earns its place on our tour because it shows you what this manuscript does to people. It shows you nearly enough to be certain. Never enough to be right. At folio 67, the plants stop and the sky begins. Circular diagrams now, wheels of stars and script, suns and moons drawn with human faces, gazing out of the vellum with a mild, unsettling patience. Folio 68 opens out into panels, and on the third of them sits a small, tight knot of 7 stars, and for once readers agree about what they are seeing. 7 stars, clustered just so, the Pleiades. The little sisterhood of stars that nearly every sky-watching culture on Earth has singled out and named. It is one of the only pictures in the entire book that plausibly corresponds to a real thing in the real world. Standing here, you can feel the ground firm up beneath your feet. It does not stay firm for long, because next come the nymphs. Folios 70 through 73 carry the zodiac, each sign a great wheel, and at the hub of each wheel a familiar emblem, fish for Pisces, a ram for Aries. And around each emblem, ring upon ring of tiny naked women, roughly 30 to a wheel. Each one holds a star. Each one is labeled with its own word of unreadable script, as if every last figure had a name, a calendar perhaps, a birth chart, a register of souls. No one can say. But look longer, and the wheel turns wrong. The cycle begins with Pisces, not with Aries, where a proper medieval zodiac ought to start. And Aries and Taurus each appear twice, a light version and a dark version, 15 nymphs apiece, as if those months had been split in two, for reasons the book declines to share. 2 details in these wheels, though, are genuine evidence. Sagittarius, the archer, is not the usual centaur. He is a man, aiming a crossbow, and that is not a whim. Drawing the archer as a crossbowman belongs to a specific tradition in the German-speaking lands of Central Europe in the 15th century. It is one of the very few honest fingerprints in the book. Whoever drew this page had seen that convention in that world at that time. Capricorn and Aquarius, meanwhile, are missing altogether. They stood on folio 74, one of the leaves. Someone, at some point, cut out of the book. 2 months of the year, excised, fate unknown. And beneath the surviving emblems run the month names, written in a dialect of French, readable, at last, actual words a person can pronounce, and written, the evidence says, by a later owner, not by the makers. Almost the only legible words in the book, and they are somebody else's. Then, at folio 75, the book stops even pretending to be normal. Quire 13, folios 75 through 84, is the section nobody forgets. Dozens of small naked women stand waist deep in pools of green water, and the pools connect tubes, channels, conduits running from basin to basin across the pages like plumbing, or the vessels of a body, or the glassware of a laboratory. Some of the women wear crowns. On folio 79, one of them holds up a small object that no one, in more than a century of study, has managed to identify. The sober readings are genuinely sober, a treatise on therapeutic bathing. Spa medicine was a real and popular genre of the 15th century. Or a text on women's medicine, on fertility in the womb. A reading modern scholarship takes seriously, and one we will return to. Or an alchemical allegory, the body as vessel, the waters as process. The honest answer is the one this book always gives. Nobody knows. But this strange green section holds one thing we know for certain, a place where the book confesses a piece of its own biography. Look at the back of folio 78. Now look at the front of folio 81. The scene is continuous. The green water flows off the edge of one page and onto the other. The pools join. The figures belong to a single composition, painted as one. These two pages were made to sit together, and today they do not. Two other leaves now stand between them, bound out of their intended order. At some point in its long life, the manuscript was taken apart and sewn back together in the wrong order. Hold on to that every time someone tells you confidently what this book says. The very pages we are turning are no longer in the order their makers intended. And then the book produces its masterpiece. Folios 85 and 86 are not ordinary leaves at all, but one enormous sheet of vellum folded down into the binding. And when you open it, fold after fold, it spreads into 6 panels, the largest drawing in the manuscript. 9 great circles, arranged 3 by 3, joined to one another by causeways, or channels, or roads. Between them, towers and castle walls and fields of stars, and in one place a form that some readers take for a volcano. It has the unmistakable grammar of a map. Things here connected to things there, and it corresponds to no place on earth that anyone has ever found. Scholars cannot even agree what category of thing it is: a map of 9 regions, a diagram of the cosmos, a scheme of weather, or of creation, pure symbol. It has been called the map to nowhere. And on another face of that same folded sheet, folio 86, verso, the maker drew small round diagrams in the teal pattern, the standard medieval shorthand for the world, the form found in 1,000 perfectly ordinary manuscripts. Understand what that means. He knew the real conventions. He could speak the visual language of his century fluently. And then he turned the fold and went somewhere no convention has ever followed. After the map, the book becomes almost reasonable. Almost. Folios 87 through 102 return to plants, but changed. No more full portraits. Now, the pages carry rows of parts. Roots, leaves, seed heads, some 240 separate pieces, a number of them recognizably copied from the big herbal drawings earlier in the book, each with its own short caption of script. And ranged along the margins stand the jars. Apothecary jars, drawn in profile, plain at first and then increasingly ornate, the containers of a pharmacy. This is the most conventionally medieval stretch of the whole manuscript. It looks, for all the world, like a druggist's index, ingredients, keyed to their sources, filed by Vessel. Georg Berisch, the Prague alchemist whose letter opened our story, guessed that the book's secret was medicine. Standing in this section, you can see exactly why. Though even here it cannot quite behave, the section looks unfinished, and its leaves, too, appear to be bound out of order. And then the pictures stop. The final section, folio 103 to the end, gives the eye nothing at all. Only text. Short, dense paragraphs, stacked one above another, page after page, each paragraph flagged in the margin with a single small star. Hundreds of them, and every reader who has ever faced this section has had the same thought, because it is impossible not to. These are recipes, formulas, remedies, procedures. The working end of the manual, the part that tells you what to do with everything you have just seen. If this book has a payload, it is here. 6 centuries of readers have stood in front of these starred paragraphs, feeling the meaning shimmer just below the surface. Not one of them has ever been able to follow a single instruction. Everything on this tour, herbal, calendar, bath book, map, pharmacy, has been a guess built from the pictures, because the pictures are the only part of this book that will speak to us. It is time to face the part that will not, the writing itself. Because if the pictures are strange, the writing is stranger. Put the pictures away now. Until this moment, we have been looking at this book from the outside in, at its soft, heavily thumbed skin, at its cheap and ordinary paints, at its garden of plants that grow nowhere on this earth, its bathing women, its map to nowhere. And it would be natural to assume that the pictures are the mystery. They are not. The pictures are strange, but strangeness in a drawing is cheap. Any patient hand can invent a plant. The real mystery, the thing that has consumed careers for more than a century, the reason this book has a name at all, is the writing that flows around those pictures. So for the next few minutes, we are going to do what almost nobody who talks about this manuscript ever does. We are going to ignore the drawings entirely and look at the words. All 38,000 of them. On your screen now is the first page, folio 1, the page a reader in the 15th century would have opened to. Set the plan aside and look only at the text. It runs in tidy lines left to right. It is divided by clear spaces into what look for all the world like words. The hand is small, rounded, even the writing of someone comfortable, someone practiced. From across a room, this could be any late medieval manuscript. A herbal in Latin, a physician's handbook, nothing to see. And then you step closer, and the alphabet dissolves under your eyes. Not one of these characters belongs to any writing system ever recorded. Not Latin, not Greek, not Hebrew or Arabic, not any script that anyone, in more than a century of organized looking, has been able to identify. Scholars call the writing Voynichese, a name that quietly concedes the problem. The only thing we can compare this script to is itself. Start with the simplest question you can ask. About an alphabet, how many letters does it have? Here is your first taste of how slippery this book is. We do not know. The core alphabet has somewhere between 20 and 30 letters, with perhaps another 15 or 20 rare characters that surface only a handful of times in the whole manuscript. Why the uncertainty? Because the count depends on where you decide. One letter ends and the next begins. Some characters look like two simpler ones fused together, and reasonable people have counted them both ways, one camp splitting the compounds apart, another counting them whole. Both readings are defensible. Neither can be proven. 400 years of study, and we have not settled question 1. We cannot count the alphabet. What we can do is describe it, because to the people who study this book, the characters have become old friends, and they have names. The most famous are the gallows, 4 tall letters with long legs and looped heads that stand high above their line of text, like scaffolds on a skyline. The name is exactly as grim as it sounds. Then there are the bench characters, low, flat forms that sit on the baseline like a stool. And every so often a gallows is drawn straddling a bench, one character standing through the body of another, a combination that might be 1 letter, or 2, or a flourish, and no one can say which. And at the ends of words, again and again come the minims, little rows of short vertical strokes, 1, 2, 3 in a row, almost exactly like the strokes the Romans used for their numerals. In the standard transcription, those endings come out as a I-I-I-N. You will be seeing a great deal of them. If some of this sounds vaguely familiar, tall, looped letters, joined pairs, strings of numeral-like strokes, it should. Taken one at a time, many of the shapes resemble things that really exist. Latin letters, medieval numerals, and above all the abbreviation marks the professional scribes of the 1400s used to write faster. The parts, in other words, are of their time and place. A 15th century penman would recognize the vocabulary of strokes. It is only the system, the way the parts combine, that matches nothing on earth. Now watch how it was written, because this is among the least appreciated facts about the manuscript. The pages on your screen now are from the back of the book, folio 103 and onward, the final section, where the pictures stop altogether and the text takes over, paragraph after dense paragraph, each one marked with a small star in the margin, page after page of it, like a book of recipes with nothing else to look at. There are about 170,000 characters in this manuscript, and they were written fast. The strokes flow. The pen moves with the smooth, unhesitating rhythm of a person writing something they know, not the careful letter-by-letter plod of a copyist reproducing symbols he doesn't understand, and not the stop and start of someone inventing as he goes. Where a drawing stood in the way, the writing simply flows around it, easy as water around a stone. And across roughly 240 pages, there are almost no corrections. No crossings, out. No false starts. Whoever wrote this, and remember, the evidence now points to a team of likely 5 separate people, could write it the way you write your own name. Be careful with that fact, though, because it is tempting to hear it as proof of meaning. Nobody writes gibberish fluently, surely. But fluency proves only that the scribes knew the script. It does not prove the script says anything. A practiced hand can pour out a private, invented writing system as smoothly as a real one. Ask any child who has kept a coded diary for a year. What the fluency does rule out is carelessness. Whatever this text is, it was produced confidently, at speed, by people who had done a great deal of it before. That is a clue. It is just not the clue it appears to be. All of this created a very practical problem for the scholars who came later. How do you even talk about this thing? How do you write a paper about a word you cannot type? For much of the 20th century, researchers invented their own private systems for forcing the characters into a typewriter and could barely read one another's notes. Then, in the late 1990s, 2 researchers, René Zonnbergen and Gabriel Landini built the system that stuck. It is called EVA, the Extensible Voynich Alphabet, and the idea is simple and rather elegant. Assign every Voynich character a Latin letter that merely looks something like it, so the manuscript can be typed, searched, counted, and fed to software. In EVA, the most common word in the book comes out as D-A-I-I-I-N, da-I-een. Another of the most frequent comes out as kedi. And the most infamous word in the manuscript, we will meet it properly in the next chapter, comes out as kokedi. And here we have to be absolutely clear, because more confusion has grown out of this one convention than out of almost anything else in the field. EVA is not a decipherment. Nobody is claiming that the most common word in the manuscript sounded like da-en, any more than a curator claims a beetle sounds like its catalog number. The Latin letters of EVA carry no sound and no meaning. They were chosen for what the characters look like, nothing more. They are labels, a filing system for shapes, a way for two scholars on two continents to be certain they are arguing about the same squiggle. So when you see these strange little words on your screen tonight, da-en, chedi, kokedi, understand what you are seeing. You are not seeing Voynichese read. You are seeing it named. No one has ever read it. So here is where we stand. An alphabet of 20-some letters that matches no known script, assembled from thoroughly ordinary medieval parts. Around 38,000 words of running text, built from a vocabulary of more than 8,000 distinct words, which is to say, the working vocabulary of a real book. Written quickly, confidently, by several practiced hands, with barely a correction across 240 pages, flowing around its own illustrations as though the scribes had been writing it all their lives. Everything about it looks like writing, and not one word of it can be read. For 300 years, the only way to attack that problem was to stare at it, to hold a page up to the candlelight, guess at a letter, hunt for a hidden saint's name or a date, and go slowly mad. It got nobody anywhere. The great insight of the 20th century was to stop treating the manuscript as a text to be stared at, and to start treating it as a specimen to be measured. To stop reading and start counting. And that is the moment this story stops being merely strange. Because when you count this book, when you weigh its words and measure its habits the way you would any language on earth, it does something that, as far as we know, no other book in the world does. How do you read a book that cannot be read? The honest answer is, you don't. You count it. Because it turns out that every language on earth leaves a fingerprint that has nothing to do with what any sentence means, a fingerprint made of frequencies. How often each word appears. How tightly one letter binds to the next. How long the words run. You can take those measurements from a text in a language you have never seen, the way a coroner can tell you a great deal about a stranger without ever learning his name. In the 20th century, the people who measured enemy ciphers for a living, and, later, the people who measure information itself, turned their instruments on the Voynich Manuscript. What they found is the strangest thing in this entire story. It is the idea the rest of this story leans on. Start with the famous test. In the 1930s, a linguist named George Ziff noticed something odd about every language he examined. Take any large text, a novel, a newspaper, the Bible, and rank its words from most common to least, and a pattern appears. The second ranked word shows up about half as often as the first, the third about a third as often, the 10th about a 10th. a smooth, sliding curve from a handful of workhorse words down to a long tail of words used once. English does it. Latin does it. Chinese does it. It is close to a law of nature for language, Zipf's law. The Voynich Manuscript obeys Zipf's law beautifully. Now, be careful about what that proves. It rules something out. This text was not made by someone simply banging away at random, because truly random scribbling does not produce that elegant sliding curve. But the test is what a scientist would call necessary, not sufficient. Real languages always pass it, yet certain kinds of structured nonsense can pass it too. So the first measurement leaves us where we started, only more unsettled. Whatever this is, it is not noise. It is the second measurement where the floor drops away. The idea is simple enough to play as a game. Cover a page of English with your hand, reveal it one letter at a time, and try at each step to guess the next letter before you see it. Sometimes you are nearly certain. After a Q, a U is all but guaranteed. Mostly you hesitate among a handful of live options. How well you do measures something real about the language, its freedom, its surprise, letter to letter. Information theorists measure that surprise in bits. One bit is one honest coin flip of uncertainty, and each additional bit doubles the possibilities. 2 bits, 4 options, 3 bits, 8. Measured this way, how uncertain is the next character, given the one before it? The reference languages of medieval Europe all land in the same neighborhood. Latin, Italian, German, roughly 3 bits, a little over. At any moment in a Latin text, the next letter is, in effect, a choice among about 8 live possibilities. That is the normal freedom of written language. Voynichese comes in at about 2 bits. The decimals shift a little depending on whose transcription you feed the computer. Worth remembering whenever anyone shows you these numbers, but the gap never closes in any transcription, in any study. About 4 live choices, where a real language keeps 8 letter by letter. This text is roughly twice as predictable as the languages it would have lived among. And notice the direction of the strangeness. The usual fear about a suspicious text is that it will prove too random, noise dressed up as writing. Voynichese fails in the opposite direction. It is too ordered. 1 letter at a time, its statistics look ordinary enough. It is the flow, the way each character leans on its neighbor. That belongs to nothing we know. English has a few corridors of certainty, like Q into U. Voynichese is corridors nearly everywhere. Where does that eerie orderliness come from? The answer emerged when scholars stopped counting letters and started dissecting words. And it may be the deepest structural fact anyone has established about this book. Voynichese words are built, assembled on a fixed template, like parts on a chassis, an opening slot, a middle, an ending, and each character appears to live in one zone and one zone only. A small set of openings begins words. A small set of endings closes them. Those numeral-like strings from the last chapter live almost exclusively at the ends. And, so far as anyone can tell, the openings never wander into the middle, and the endings never start a word. Real languages have tendencies about where their letters sit. They do not have walls, and the linguists who survey this rigidity reach for words like unheard of. The nearest familiar thing is not language at all. It is a telephone number or a license plate. Every entry different, every entry built the same way. The structure is so rigid that a small mechanical procedure, a handful of rules you could write on an index card, can generate virtually the entire vocabulary of the manuscript. And this is not a separate curiosity from the entropy result, it is the explanation for it. When every word in a book is assembled on the same template, the next letter is rarely a surprise. The two measurements are one discovery. This text behaves less like speech and more like the output of a system. And the strangeness keeps stacking. Measure the lengths of the words. They bunch tightly around 5 or 6 characters in a neat, symmetrical bell curve, a tidy shape that language does not make. Real languages are lopsided, a fat population of tiny words, the of, to, a, is, hauling the grammar around, trailing off into a thin tail of long ones. Voynichese has almost no one, or 2-letter words at all. The connective tissue, the little words that do the pointing and joining, is simply missing. Either this language somehow does without them, or it hides them inside its longer words, or the words are not words. Then there is the habit you can see from across the room, the eeriest thing this manuscript does. Look at the screen. This is folio 75 from the bathing section, and there, on one line, sits the word transcribed cockady 4 times in a row. Cockady, 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 e.g. On folio 40, oham, oham, oham. On folio 81, o. It is not an aberration, it is a signature. All through the book, words repeat back to back, 2 and 3 and up to 5 times, while words that differ by a single stroke crowd together on the same lines, like one word caught mid-mutation. Real languages flee that kind of repetition. We double a word by accident or for emphasis, and almost never 3 times, letter perfect, in a row. And this, concretely, is why every simple decoding collapses on arrival. Swap each character for a letter in any alphabet you like, and these lines come out as a stammer. Pepper, 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 pepper. No cipher clerk of the 15th century wrote his secrets that way. One more oddity, and then the scales. Tip. The text seems to know where it is on the page. Roughly 85% of paragraphs open with one of the gallows characters, those tall scaffold letters, as if a paragraph required a crown, and words at the ends of lines lean toward particular endings, as though the right-hand margin reached into the text and bent the spelling. The researcher who first documented much of this concluded that the true unit of this text is not the sentence and not the word. It is the line. Sit with how strange that is. In every real act of writing, the line is an accident of the page. Break it anywhere, the words don't care. Here, the geometry of the page appears to be part of the writing itself. So stack the whole case. Too predictable, letter to letter, twice as ordered as any language ever measured. A vocabulary assembled on one rigid template, word lengths in an unnaturally tidy bell. The little grammatical words missing entirely. Compulsive, back-to-back repetition. Spelling that answers to the margins of the page rather than to anything like grammar. Every arrow points the same direction, away from language, toward mechanism. By this evidence, the book is not a voice. It is a process, and a process a 15th century workshop could have run by hand. You can feel the case closing. Except, in 2013, 2 physicists, Marcello Montemurro and Damien Zanetti, asked a different question. Not how does letter follow letter, but how do words spread across the whole book? Because meaning, real meaning, leaves its own signature, not up close, but at long range. In any real book, content words cluster where their subject lives. A chapter on navigation is thick with sails and stars. The vocabulary breathes with the topic, hundreds of words at a time. Scatter a book's words at random, and that structure dies instantly. So they measured where the information lives in the Voynich Manuscript, at what scale its significant words come and go. The manuscript passed. The significant words cluster, and they cluster in the right places, tracking the illustrated sections. The impossible plants favor one working vocabulary, the bathing pages another, exactly as if the sections really are about different things. And the information peaks on a scale of 600 to 800 words, the same long horizon you find in real languages and do not find in shuffled text. In their judgment, that result severely limits the scope of any hoax hypothesis. Whatever produced this book did not just run a word mill for 240 pages. It changed its behavior by subject, coherently, section after section, across the entire manuscript. So now hold both halves in your head at once, because this exact tension is the intellectual heart of the Voynich problem, and nothing in the rest of this story escapes its pull. Up close, letter by letter, the text is too regular to be a language. Stand back, page by page, and it is organized precisely the way a language organizes itself, flowing from topic to topic in step with its own pictures. It fails the microscope and passes the telescope. A hoax explains the first half and stumbles on the second. A real language explains the second half and chokes on the first. And the cipher? Well, hiding a message is supposed to make text look more random, not less. Hold that thought. It will matter again before the end. Understand, the numbers are not in dispute. Skeptics and believers run the same tests and get the same values. The mathematics is perfectly clear. It is simply perfectly clear in two directions at once. And the counting had one more secret to give up. An older one from the 1970s, found by a man who had spent his career breaking codes for the United States Navy. It is the closest thing this silent book has ever offered to a confession, and it is this: whoever made it did not speak with one voice. His name was Prescott Currier, and he was not a linguist and not a professor. He was a career cryptologist for the United States Navy, a man whose working life had been spent taking apart other people's secret writing. And in the 1970s, in his retirement, he did to the Voynich Manuscript what he had done to enemy traffic for decades. He stopped looking at it as a book, broke it into pages, and ran the statistics on each page separately. In 1976, he presented what he had found. The pages do not all behave the same way. They sort, cleanly, consistently, into two statistical populations. Two varieties of Voynichese, living side by side in one manuscript. Currier, with a cryptologist's allergy to overclaiming, gave them the most bloodless names available, language A and language B. And he was careful about that word, language. He was not claiming there were two spoken tongues in the book. What he had found were two statistically distinct systems, called them two dialects of whatever Voynichese is, or two settings of whatever process made it. And the differences are not subtle. There is a common word ending, transcribed dy, that is everywhere in the B pages and nearly absent from A. The most common word in the A pages is the one transcribed da, Ian. The most common word in the B pages is chetty, a word which in the A pages essentially never occurs at all. One particular pair of characters accounts for a fraction of 1% of the text in A, in B, around 13%. Stop and take that in. The manuscript's own most basic habits, its favorite word, its favorite endings, flip from one part of the book to another, more than tenfold in places. If this were an English library, it would be as if half the books leaned on the word "the," and the other half had never heard of it. And in the large, B looks like A with extensions. Nearly everything A does, B also does, and more, which whispers, without proving, that one may have grown out of the other. Now put the two dialects on the map of the book, because they are not scattered at random. Language. A owns most of the herbal pages and the apothecary jars. Language B owns the starred recipes at the back, and the bathing section, the green pools we walked through an hour ago, every single page of it is B. And in the herbal section, the two interleave. Look at the screen, two facing herbal pages, same style of drawing, same script. To your eye, one seamless book. To the statistics, the left page and the right page are speaking two different dialects. Turn a leaf, and the book changes its voice. Turn another, and it changes back. Now tie in a thread from earlier in the evening. The handwriting says this book was made by a team, likely 5 scribes. When Lisa Fagan Davis mapped those 5 hands onto Currier's 2 dialects, the result, still preliminary but striking, came out clean, broadly. Scribes 1 and 4 write language A, scribes 2, 3, and 5 write language B. And no scribe writes both. The split is not one writer drifting over the years. It travels with the people. Whatever the difference between A and B is, each scribe carried only one of them in his head. What does it mean? No one can rule a single explanation out. 2 authors, 2 dialects of one lost tongue, 2 subjects demanding 2 vocabularies, 2 settings of a cipher, or a system evolving, a taught first, then bent and extended into B as new hands learned it. Each explanation fits. None can be proven, and our art eats B's. Currier himself decoded nothing, claimed nothing, and said so plainly. But do not mistake that for failure, because what Currier left behind may be worth more than a decipherment. He left a test. Any solution to the Voynich Manuscript, any claim in any century that it is Latin or Hebrew or code or nonsense, now has to explain why half the book runs on Da'in and the other half runs on Chedi, and why the split follows the scribes. A theory that cannot reproduce Currier's 2 languages has not solved the book. It has only solved the small piece its author happened to stare at. Keep that test in your pocket. In the next hour, you will have many occasions to use it. One last page before the wars begin. On your screen now is Folio 11.6, verso, the final page of the manuscript. The Voynichese has ended. And there, in a cramped and faded hand, someone has left 4 lines written mostly in ordinary Latin letters. Our alphabet, at last. A later owner, most likely, perhaps recording his own attempt at the riddle. 4 lines, in characters every school child of the last 5 centuries could name. And we cannot read them either. No 2 scholars agree on what they say. The most famous words in them, transcribed Michiton Oladabas, mean nothing in any known language. It is the book's final, quiet act of defiance. Even where it speaks in our own letters, it keeps its silence, and turns its readers into part of the riddle. The man who made those 2 strange words famous, who leaned over that last page and pulled Michiton Oladabas out of it, believed he had done far more than read a margin note. He believed he had read the whole book. In April of 1921, at the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, the same meeting, the same stage where Wilfred Voynich told his tale of the castle and the chests. A professor from the University of Pennsylvania rose to announce that the mystery was solved. His name was William Romaine Newbold. He was brilliant, respected, and utterly sincere. What he claimed to have found, hidden in the very strokes of the ink, was the lost work of one of the greatest scientific minds of the Middle Ages. Newspapers carried it around the world, and Eminent scholars stood and applauded. Every word of it was wrong, and the manner in which it was wrong would become the template for a century of clever people breaking themselves against this book. The decipherment wars had begun. Everything you've just heard, the clockwork words, the two dialects, the text too orderly to be a language and too fluent to be nothing, took a century to learn, one reluctant measurement at a time. It is worth pausing on that, because in 1921, none of it existed. There were no statistics, no entropy, no language A or B. There was only a small, worn book that nobody on earth could read, a bookseller who badly needed the world to care about it, and a professor who had already given it everything he had. We have been in this room before. It is April of 1921 at the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, the same occasion where Wilfred Voynich told his story of the chests in the ancient castle. But Voynich was only the opening act. The man the room had come to hear was William Romain Newbold, and he had come to tell them that the book was read. He was not a crank. Hold on to that, because everything that follows will tempt you to remember him as one. Newbold held the Adam Seibert Chair of Intellectual and Moral Philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. He was a scholar of genuine standing, a philosopher steeped in the psychology of religion, with a serious study of cryptography besides. In 1919, at Voynich's own invitation, he had taken up the manuscript. 2 years later, he stood in Philadelphia with his answer. The author, he announced, was Roger Bacon, the 13th century English friar whom legend remembered as a scientist born centuries before science. And the book, Newbold said, was Bacon's secret record of discoveries so far ahead of their time they had to be hidden, and hidden so well that it had taken 600 years and one Philadelphia professor to bring them back. How had he done it? And the method, this time, is the whole story. Newbold had noticed, under a strong magnifying glass, that the edges of the manuscript's characters were not smooth. They broke apart, under the lens, into tiny irregular strokes, minute serrations along each stroke, and he became convinced that these were the writing, the flowing script that fills every page, the loops and gallows we have spent 3 chapters learning to see. All of it, he said, was a decoy. Meaningless. The real message hid in the microscopic marks along each character's edge, a shorthand so small it could only be read under magnification, designed to defeat every reader but the most determined. So he looked closer. He read the tiny strokes off the edges of the glyphs one by one and turned them into Latin letters. And then came the final step. The Latin that emerged was scrambled, so Newbold took it in great blocks, 55 to 110 letters at a time, and rearranged them freely until intelligible Latin sentences appeared. He called the system anagrammed micrographic shorthand. Keep those blocks of letters in mind. We will be coming back for them, and what sentences they were. Out of the shuffled Latin came a Roger Bacon who had built a compound microscope centuries before anyone else, who had built a telescope and turned it on the heavens centuries before Galileo. On one astronomical page, folio 68er, Newbold found what he declared to be the great nebula of Andromeda, drawn with a spiral structure no unaided human eye should ever have seen. In the drawings of the biological pages, he found germ cells, spermatozoa, the hidden machinery of life itself, seen, somehow, by a friar who died around 1292. The physicians of Philadelphia were being told that a medieval monk had looked through lenses no history recorded and seen things no medieval eye should ever have seen. The world took it seriously. That is the part that should unsettle you. This was not a tabloid sensation dismissed by the learned. The learned came aboard. The great French medievalist Etienne Gilson examined the work and was impressed. The Bacon scholar Raoul Carton endorsed it outright. Newbold lectured widely, a famous man now, the human key to the world's most mysterious book. Not everyone bowed. The historian Lynn Thorndike voiced his doubts in public as early as June of 1921, barely 2 months after the announcement. But doubt is quiet, and wonder is loud, and for a decade the wonder had the room. Newbold spent his remaining years extending the decipherment. He died in 1926, believing all of it. 2 years after his death, his friend and colleague Roland Grubb Kent gathered the work and published it as The Cipher of Roger Bacon, the theory, complete and confident, in a book Newbold never held. Then came John Matthews Manley. Manley was that rare thing, a man with standing in both worlds, the manuscript touches. He was chair of English at the University of Chicago, a medievalist of the first rank. And he was a real cryptanalyst. In the First World War, he had served as second in command of MI8, the American military's cipher bureau, where he helped break the German spy cipher known as Voynichese. He knew old manuscripts and he knew codes, and in July of 1931, in the medieval studies journal Speculum, across nearly 50 patient pages, he took Newbold's system apart. The first blow was almost unbearably simple. Manley looked at the microscopic strokes, the serrations Newbold had spent a decade reading, and identified them. They were cracks. Ink that has sat on rough vellum for 500 years does not lie flat forever. It dries, it shrinks, it splinters at the edges. Under a lens, every stroke of any old manuscript shatters into exactly the kind of tiny marks Newbold had been transcribing. The shorthand was craquelure, the ordinary ruin of aged ink. There had been no microscope in the 13th century. The only microscope in this story was Newbold's own, and what it had been showing him all those years was time doing what time does. The second blow finished whatever was left. Even if the micro-writing had been real, Manley showed, the anagram step doomed the whole enterprise. Because a block of 55 to 110 letters, rearranged freely, can be made to say almost anything at all. The number of possible orderings is astronomical. Somewhere in that haystack is nearly any sentence you care to find. A method that can produce anything proves nothing. There was no unique answer, nothing to check. The same block of letters would surrender a different message to every decoder who tried, each as defensible as the last. The decipherment was not a discovery. It was a mirror. Manley's verdict was as blunt as scholarship permits. In my opinion, the Newbold claims are entirely baseless and should be definitely and absolutely rejected. And then he wrote the sentence that matters most, that the decipherments had been the products of Newbold's intense enthusiasm and his ingenious subconscious. Read that carefully, because it is the kindest cruel sentence in this entire literature. Manley was not calling him a fraud. He was calling him a believer, and pointing at the trap door every believer stands on. Give the subconscious 10,000 possible readings, and it will always, always find the one its owner is looking for. Newbold had not deciphered Roger Bacon. He had deciphered William Romaine Newbold. Others concurred, the art historian Erwin Panofsky among them, and a government cryptologist named William Friedman. Remember that second name. Now stand back from the wreckage, because you have just watched the next 100 years performed once, in miniature. Learn the shape. A champion arrives, credentialed, serious, no fool. The champion begins not with the text, but with the answer, a hidden genius, a lost language, a secret history. The method comes second, and it is always elastic. Elastic enough to deliver whatever the champion already believes. The answer duly appears. There are headlines, there are endorsements, there is a decade of wonder. And then someone patient examines not the answer but the method, and the whole cathedral comes down at once, because it was never resting on the book. It was resting on the believer. You will see this arc again in the 1940s, in the 1970s, in 2004, in 2017, in 2019, and in the age of thinking machines. Only the costumes change. There is a quiet coda, which no one in that Philadelphia room could have known. When the vellum itself was finally put to the question, in an Arizona laboratory in 2009, the skins came back dated to the early 15th century, 1404 to 1438. Roger Bacon had been dead for more than a century before the calves that carry this writing were born. Newbold's theory was not merely wrong in its method, it was impossible in its premise. But notice, nobody needed the physics. The method was the tell, and the method was visible in 1931 to anyone willing to check the working instead of admiring the answer. If enthusiasm was the disease, the cure seemed plain enough. Send for people who have none. Professionals. People who did not love the book, did not need it to be anything, and had spent their whole lives learning the discipline of not believing. As it happens, the middle of the 20th century produced the finest such people who have ever lived, minds built for the single purpose of destroying mysteries. Nearly all of them would take their turn. The book was waiting. Remember the name we set aside at the end of Newbold's ruin. The government cryptologist who read Manley's demolition and agreed with every word of it. His name was William Frederick Friedman, and if the 20th century built a mind for the specific purpose of destroying mysteries, it was his. Understand who this man was, because the weight of this chapter rests on it. Friedman was the preeminent American cryptologist of his age, very possibly of any age. He led the team that broke Purple, the Japanese diplomatic cipher machine, one of the great intelligence feats of the Second World War. The very word for what he did, cryptanalysis, is a word he coined. He named the discipline he then proceeded to dominate. Where Newbold had been a lover of mysteries, Friedman was their executioner. He did not approach an unread text with wonder. He approached it the way a locksmith approaches a lock, as a finite mechanical problem, solvable by method, patience, and mathematics. To such a mind, a book that cannot be read is not a romance. It is an affront. And he did not come alone. Elizabeth Smith Friedman, Elizabeth, spelled with 3 E's, was a codebreaker of legend in her own right. Not a great man's wife, but a great cryptologist who happened to be married to another one. She broke the ciphers of the rum-running fleets. She broke the ciphers of Nazi spy rings. Between the two of them, the Friedmans had read more secret writing than perhaps any 2 human beings who ever lived. The Voynich Manuscript would sit on their shared horizon for decades, the one lock in the shop that never opened. Friedman's first organized assault began in 1944, while the war still had a year to run. He assembled what came to be called the First Study Group, professional cryptanalysts, people who broke enemy ciphers by day, volunteering their evenings to a 500-year-old herbal. Picture the room, because this is where the 15th century meets the machine age. A government office after hours. Photostats of the manuscript's pages pinned and stacked, the impossible plants, the flowing script. And the first order of business is drudgery. The swirling glyphs must be transliterated, symbol by symbol, into plain characters a machine can hold, and punched onto IBM cards. one line of the unreadable book to a card. Card after card, tray after tray, fed through tabulating machines that count and sort and count again. The clatter of the sorter in an empty building, frequency tables spooling out where sense refused to. It was the first time in history the manuscript faced machinery, and the manuscript absorbed it all without a mark. The group worked from 1944 to 1946. Then it disbanded, its members scattered back into their lives with no solution. 16 years later, Friedman tried again. The second study group convened in 1962, and by now the machine age had grown teeth. The plan this time was to prepare the text for an RCA computer, a room-filling instrument of tape reels and humming cabinets, the kind of machine that was, in 1962, the sharpest analytical blade on Earth. Picture that room too, fluorescent light, spinning reels, a medieval manuscript reduced to magnetic pulses. A year later, this group had also dissolved, and the manuscript remained exactly what it had been. 2 campaigns, 2 decades apart, the best professional codebreakers alive, the best machines their century could offer. Nothing. But Friedman had not come away empty. He had come away with an idea, and the idea is the heart of this chapter, because it is the first conclusion in our story that was reached by ruling things out rather than by wishing things in. Friedman had watched every standard tool of his trade fail against the text's strange arithmetic, the repetitions, the rigid word structure, the statistics we walk through in Chapter 5. And he came to suspect that the tools were failing because they were built for the wrong kind of object. The manuscript, he concluded, was probably not an enciphered natural language at all. It was an early attempt at an artificial language, a language constructed from scratch on logical first principles of the kind philosophers call a priori. Not a disguise laid over Latin or Greek, but a system invented whole, categories and classes and slots, built by design rather than grown by history. If he was right, the manuscript anticipated by 2 centuries the famous universal language schemes of the 1600s, the projects of men like John Wilkins, George Dalgarno, Cave Beck, who dreamed of a rational language in which every word declared its own meaning. It would explain, at a stroke, why the words behave like machinery and not like memory. Now, how does a man like Friedman publish an idea like that? He cannot prove it. He knows exactly what unprovable Voynich theories look like. He watched Manly bury one. But he believes it, and he wants history to record that he thought of it first. What he did next is one of the strangest and most human gestures in this whole century of failure, and every word of it is documented. In January of 1959, William and Elizabeth Friedman published a scholarly article called Acrostics, Anagrams, and Chaucer, a study, fittingly, of hidden messages people claim to find in old texts. And tucked into it, as a footnote, was a single odd sentence: "I put no trust in anagrammatic acrostic ciphers, for they are of little real value, a waste, and may prove nothing." Finis. On its face, a dry, methodological aside. It was nothing of the kind. The sentence was itself an anagram, every letter of it, concealing Friedman's true conclusion about the Voynich Manuscript. The solution was sealed in an envelope, to be opened only after his death. He died in 1969. The envelope was opened, and the letters of that dismissive little footnote rearranged into this. The Voynich MSS was an early attempt to construct an artificial or universal language of the a priori type. Friedman. Sit with the layers of that for a moment. The man who watched free anagramming destroy Newbold used an anagram, but used it the one honest way an anagram can be used. Newbold shuffled letters to find his answer. Friedman shuffled letters to hide his, fixing it in advance, sealed, unique, witnessed. One is an escape hatch, the other is a time capsule. And notice the cover text he chose, a warning against trusting anagrams, which is itself true and which describes the exact method that had seduced the last great claimant. The joke is perfect, and it is also a confession of modesty. After 2 study groups, the machines, and 40 years of attention from the greatest codebreaker alive, the sum of what Friedman had to leave the world was a hypothesis. Carefully phrased, unproven, and hedged in its own cover text with the words, "may prove nothing." Elizabeth outlived him, and her patience with the wider circus was thinner. In a Washington Post article in 1962, she surveyed the endless parade of amateur solvers, the confident letter-for-letter substitutions arriving year after year, each one certain, and pronounced them all in 2 words that could stand as the epitaph of this entire chapter, doomed to utter frustration. The story now crosses the Atlantic. Brigadier John Tiltman was Friedman's British counterpart and friend, a distinguished Army cryptographer, a veteran of Bletchley Park, one of the most respected codebreakers Britain ever produced, and a close collaborator with the American agencies after the war. Friedman, naturally, pressed his artificial language idea on him. And Tiltman did exactly what a professional does with a colleague's beautiful hypothesis. He tried to kill it. He went through the constructed language schemes of the 17th century, the Wilkins and Dalgarno projects and the rest, looking for a structural match to Voynichese, and found none. He tested the idea, and he stayed unconvinced. Not opposed, unconvinced. The distinction matters, and we will honor it. Tiltman's own reading of the text was published after a 1967 talk under a title that concedes everything in advance: The Voynich Manuscript, the most mysterious manuscript in the world. His conclusion was a professional's shrug of genuine defeat. The text, he found, is not a standard cipher of any natural language. What he saw instead was, in his words, a cumbersome mixture of different kinds of substitution, a system, but not one whose shape he could name. And he could not read it. Mark the geometry of that. The 2 greatest codebreakers of their age stood on either side of the same book. One guessed at a constructed language, the other tested the guess and set it down unpersuaded, and neither man read a single word. You have already met the one durable discovery this world produced. Prescott Currier, of the same professional lineage, naval cryptology, did not read the book either. What he found, as we saw in the last chapter, were the 2 languages, A and B, 2 statistical dialects, sorted by scribe, running through one manuscript. Not a solution, a constraint, a fence around every solution to come. And that, it turns out, is the codebreakers' true legacy here. They opened nothing. They ruled out nearly everything, which brings us to the strangest document in this chapter. In 1978, the National Security Agency, the institutional heir of everything the Friedmans and Tiltman had built, published a monograph on the Voynich Manuscript, written by one of its own analysts, Mary D'Imperio. Its title tells you how the professionals had come to regard their adversary, the Voynich Manuscript, an elegant enigma. No longer a lock to be picked, a thing to be admired. The book solves nothing and never pretends to. It is a survey. Every transcription scheme, every statistical result, Currier's languages, the study groups, the corpses of the failed solutions laid out and examined with an analyst's tidiness. closing with a call for the systematic, computer-assisted study its author knew was coming. For some 30 years, it stood as the standard reference, and it remains the most quoted work ever written about the manuscript. Feel the weight of that. The agency whose business is reading the unreadable published, as its contribution to this problem, an annotated map of a century of failure. So add up the 20th century, the man who broke purple, his wife who broke the rum runners and the spy rings, a brigadier out of Bletchley Park, a career analyst at the NSA with the resources of the most powerful signals, intelligence agency in history behind her, punch cards, tabulators, a computer, decades of after-hours devotion from people whose entire profession was the destruction of exactly this kind of mystery. Their combined yield, a consensus that whatever this book is, it is not a conventional cipher, one unproven hypothesis, hidden in an anagram and hedged by its own author, and a monograph documenting, elegantly, that nobody had solved anything. That is the verdict, and it has never been overturned. Not a normal cipher. Perhaps not a cipher at all. And buried inside that verdict is a question none of these people relished, because it aims at the floor they stood on. Everything a codebreaker does rests on a single axiom. Beneath the noise, there is a message. Every technique Friedman ever invented assumes it. Every triumph at Bletchley depended on it. The one adversary the entire art is helpless against is an enemy who is never saying anything at all. So suppose the axiom fails here. Suppose the best minds of the century came away empty, not because the lock was too strong, but because the door has no other side. No language. No cipher. Nothing defined. Only the appearance of meaning, manufactured with such care that it carries real language's own fingerprints, the very statistics we measured in Chapter 5, while meaning nothing whatsoever. For most of a century, the professionals could comfort themselves that no medieval forger could possibly have faked all that. Then, in 2004, a researcher with a table of syllables and a piece of card with holes cut in it showed how cheaply it might be done. That is the next door. It is the darkest of the three. By the late 1970s, the profession that exists to destroy mysteries had formally given up on this one. The codebreaker's verdict, carefully worded and strange, was this: whatever the Voynich Manuscript is, it is not a normal cipher. Enfolded inside that verdict, unstated, was a question that nobody who had given years to the problem much wanted to say aloud. The best minds of the cryptologic century had gone looking for the message and had not found it. There is one explanation for a failure like that which no amount of further searching can ever fix. What if there is no message? It is an unwelcome idea, and it is worth being honest about why. 240 pages, 14 or 15 calfskins, 5 scribes writing fluently in a script somebody had to devise and each of them had to learn. Months of coordinated labor. The whole weight of the object seems to argue that nobody does all of that for nothing. But notice what that argument is. It is a feeling, an intuition about effort and motive, and this story is, so far, mostly a museum of what happens when intuition leads. So, in the early 2000s, the question quietly turned technical. Never mind whether anyone would write a book of nothing. Could they? Could a person, using only what the 15th century offered, produce 200-odd pages of meaningless text that still carries the statistical fingerprints of meaning, the ones we met earlier tonight? Word frequencies that obey Zipf's law, that eerily low entropy, a text more orderly than any real language. Words with a rigid internal anatomy, prefix, root, suffix, lengths bunched in their neat, unnatural curve. If the answer is no, the manuscript means something, and the search goes on. If the answer is yes, the search has spent 100 years standing on air. In 2004, an academic at Keele University in England set out to answer it. Gordon Rugg was not a cryptographer, and he had not come up through medieval manuscripts. He was a psychologist, and his specialty, this is the detail worth keeping, was expert error, the ways trained, intelligent people go wrong together. He had built a procedure he called the verifier method for re-examining stuck problems, hunting for the assumption everyone inherited and no one tested. Pointed at the Voynich, the inherited assumption stood out at once. For a century, everyone from Newbold to the National Security Agency had taken it as given that language-like statistics imply language. Nobody had checked whether nonsense could be manufactured to order. So Rugg built a nonsense factory out of paper. It has two parts. The first is a table whose columns hold meaningless syllables, each kind locked to its own column, prefixes, roots, suffixes, exactly as Voynichese glyphs are locked to their own zones. The second is a card with holes cut in it. The device is called a Cardin grill, after Girolamo Cardano, the 16th century polymath who described it. In its original use, it hid a real message inside an innocent-looking one. Rugg ran it backward. Lay the card on the table. Through the three windows, 3 syllables appear. Write them down as one word. Slide the card and write the next. That is the entire method. No language, no cipher, no meaning, anywhere, at any stage. And the output looks like Voynichese. Not superficially, but statistically. Because each syllable can live only in its own column, the words obey the same rigid anatomy. The lengths bunch. The vocabulary repeats, and near repeats. Rugg estimated that one person, alone, with a grill and a set of tables, could have produced the entire manuscript in somewhere between 250 and 500 hours. One quiet winter, he published in Cryptologia, the field's journal of record, under a title that kept its question mark, An Elegant Hoax, and wrote it up for Scientific American that July. He even nominated a culprit, Edward Kelly, a documented con man in the orbit of the Elizabethan magus, John D.E.E., 2 names. We will meet again and complicate before the night is out. The press, which does not traffic in question marks, reported that the mystery had been solved. Solved, in this telling, by dissolving. There had never been anything to read. The specialists were not so sure, and their objections were good ones. First, the calendar. The Cardin grill is documented around 1550. The calves whose skins became the manuscript died between 1404 and 1438. A hoaxer using Cardano's device would have had to write on parchment more than a century old. Not impossible, but the polite word for it is strained. Second, and more serious, Rugg had reproduced the statistics of Voynichese, not Voynichese. He never retrofitted so much as a paragraph of the actual text from his tables. His demonstration proved that a hoax of this general kind was possible, not that this book was one. And third, the fine grain, the real text, has habits. A sliding card does not obviously explain. Words that behave differently at the beginnings and ends of lines, structure stretching across whole sections. Rugg, with a colleague, answered part of this in 2017, showing that batch after batch of grill-made gibberish still obeyed Zipf's law. But the gap between could have been faked and was faked stood open, and it was wide. Then the hoax hypothesis produced a second version, quieter, stranger, and much harder to wave away. In 2019, Torsten Tim and Andreas Schinner had shown in 2007 that the text statistics were consistent with a mechanical, mindless process. Published a method that needs no grill, no tables, no device at all. They call it self-citation, and it works like this. The scribe writes a few seed words. Then, for every word that follows, he glances back at what he has already written, picks a word nearby on the page, and copies it with a small change. A glyph swapped, a piece added or dropped. That is the whole rule. The text generates itself out of itself, line after line, page after page. Run the numbers on text made this way, and something cold happens. Zipf's law, yes. The low, unlanguage-like entropy, yes. Copying is order, and a text built from its own recent past is predictable in exactly the right way. The bunched word lengths, yes. And the manuscript's eeriest habit, the one no cipher and no natural language has ever explained, the same word standing 2, 3, 4 times in a row, near twins clustering along a line, kokety, stops being an anomaly. It becomes the method showing through the page. If every new word is a copy of a neighbor, lightly changed, then of course the neighbors look like siblings. And notice what this version does not require. No 16th century device on 15th century skin. A pen, the page, and a habit, a rule simple enough for any of the 5 scribes to carry in their heads. It is tool-free, it is chronologically clean, and it reproduces every signature statistic the manuscript has. That is the serious case that the book says nothing. Not a sneer, a working model. 100 years of failed decipherment is precisely what it predicts, because you cannot pick a lock that was never built. Even the manuscript's strange perfection fits. 240 pages, remember, and almost no corrections. It is worth asking what, in a text like this, a correction would even have looked like. The case is serious. It is not closed. Standing against it is the finding from earlier tonight, Montemurro and Zanetta's discovery that the manuscript's vocabulary clusters and drifts across the book the way real topics do. Plant words thickening among the plants, star words among the stars, structure at long range, at the scale of whole sections, which a glance back and copy rule has no obvious business producing. A result that, in their words, limits severely the scope of the hoax hypothesis. And behind the mathematics stands the older human objection, 38,000 words of disciplined, self-consistent nonsense, sustained across 5 hands and 2 statistical dialects, with the vocabulary politely changing whenever the pictures do. As a hoax, it would be an extraordinary object. Both positions are alive in the peer-reviewed literature tonight. Near the end of our story, we will come back to why the statistics may never be able to referee between them. What the hoax case changed in the end was not the answer. It was the floor. Before 2004, every failure to read the manuscript could be filed under not yet. The key still out there, waiting. After Rugg, and doubly after Tim and Schinner, there is a version of this story with nothing beneath the text at all, and it can no longer be ruled out. Every claimed solution now has a new bar to clear first. Show that what you found could not have been produced by a sliding card or a glancing eye. Show us your meaning is better than nothing. It is a bar almost nobody clears. Which brings us to the people who kept arriving anyway, certain, each one of them, that the book meant something and that they alone could read it. What follows is a parade. Keep your eye on the shape of it. The shape is always the same. By now, you know the shape of it. A champion appears from somewhere just adjacent to the field, close enough to be fluent, far enough to be free. The champion does not begin with the text. The champion begins with the answer, a hidden science, a lost tongue, a doctor's handbook, and works backward to a method. And the method always shares one property with every method before it: enough freedom, enough moments where the solver simply chooses that it will produce whatever its owner already believes. Then the announcement, then the headlines, then the collapse. We watched it happen once at full length with Professor Newbold, whose microscope found the 20th century hiding in cracked ink. The cases that follow move faster. What follows is a field guide. 1943. Joseph Martin Feely of Rochester, New York, self-publishes a book called Roger Bacon's Cipher, The Right Key Found. You will notice the title does not contain a question mark. Feely's claim the manuscript is Roger Bacon's private scientific diary, written in heavily abbreviated medieval Latin behind a simple letter-for-letter substitution, and he had found the key. What the key produced on inspection was Latin that no Latin would recognize, broken, ungrammatical, unreadable even to the specialists most willing to be convinced. The letter mappings and the expansions of the supposed abbreviations were arbitrary, chosen, his critics observed, at precisely the points where meaning needed to come out. The scholarly rejection was unanimous. The NSA's own survey of the field would later record the verdict without ceremony. And the whole edifice was chained, like Newbold's, to an author who had died around 1292, more than a century, as the radiocarbon would eventually confirm, before the calves whose skins carry this text were born. The 1970s produced a stranger case from a grander address. Robert Brumbaugh was a professor of medieval philosophy at Yale, the university whose own Beinecke library by then held the manuscript. He could walk over and look at it whenever he liked, and did, for years. His position was a remarkable double. He believed the book was probably a forgery, built long after Bacon, he thought, to be sold at a fabulous price to an emperor, and, at the same time, that he could partially read it. His cipher turned the glyphs into decimal digits, and the digits back into letters, with each digit permitted to stand for any of several letters. By this route, he read plant labels and star labels, and in 1976, he announced that the name Roger Bacon lay encoded in the text as a 10-digit number. The trouble is arithmetic. A key in which one digit may become many letters is not a key, it is a license. Critics noticed that whenever a stretch of text refused to fall into place, the glyph assignments quietly changed. His star names matched no known medieval system. No reading could be reproduced. Brumbaugh's manuscript was a fake that could nonetheless be read, a solution with the rare distinction of being unfalsifiable in both directions at once. To be fair to the parade, not everyone in it marches the same way. In 2014, it produced its most careful figure. Stephen Bax was a professor of applied linguistics at the University of Bedfordshire, a real linguist, making, for once, a deliberately small claim. Not a solution. A provisional, partial decoding, in his own words 10 words and 14 symbols, offered tentatively. His method was the oldest respectable one in the business, the same approach that opened the Egyptian hieroglyphs: find the proper names first. Match a drawing to a plant, a star cluster to its likely label, and let the name teach you the sound values. By this route, Bax offered juniper, a word he read as auror, cousin to the Arabic and Hebrew Rar, the constellation Taurus, written beside the 7 stars of the Pleiades, Con Tyron, for centauri, coriander, hellebore, black cumin, cotton. 10 small candles in a very dark room, lit by someone with the right training and no grandiosity. He was taken more seriously than anyone since the Codebreakers, because he had earned it. The critique, when it came, was gentler in tone and total in effect. The fullest came from the cipher historian Nick Pelling, and it had 3 prongs. Circularity backs assumed the plant's identities from the pictures, then fitted readings to the assumption, the picture proving the word proving the picture. Cherry-picking, his juniper word sits in a run of text that actually reads auror, or oro, are a stutter, not a botanical label. Plant names do not behave that way in any language on earth. And looseness, 3 different Voynich letters, in his scheme, were all assigned the same sound, R. Pelling's summary was blunt. Of the 9 words Bax claims, I disagree with the evidence, reasoning, and linguistic rationale for every single one. No grammar ever grew out of the 10 words. Nothing generalized to the rest of the text. Bax died in 2017, and the 10 words have not become 11. Then, in the autumn of 2017, the shape reasserted itself at full speed in the most respectable venue imaginable. On the 5th of September, the Times Literary Supplement, the London Review, where the century's great critics made their names, published a cover article titled Voynich Manuscript, The Solution. The definite article was doing a great deal of work. The solver was Nicholas Gibz, a British history researcher and television writer, and his claim ran as follows. The manuscript is a women's health manual compiled from standard medieval medical sources. Its words are not words at all. Each one is a Latin ligature, a bundled abbreviation standing for an entire medicinal term. And the reason nobody could read the book was that its key, an index matching the abbreviations to their meanings, had been lost from the back. As proof, he translated 2 lines. 2 lines. The collapse took days, and the person most identified with it is Lisa Fagan Davis, medievalist, executive director of the Medieval Academy of America. Remember the name. From here to the end of our story, she is the one standing at the door. Her assessment was surgical. Expanded according to Gibz's system, the text doesn't result in Latin that makes sense. The lost index, he has no evidence for such an index. The one substantive element, the women's health reading, was not new. Scholars had been discussing the manuscript's baths and bodies for years. As for the venue, she was surprised the TLS published it. A literary weekly had run, without a medievalist review, a solution to the most examined manuscript on earth. And then the sentence that explains her entire role in this story, the weary arithmetic of a debunker of record. I've reviewed dozens of solutions, and this one is just as unconvincing as the last 3,000. Which brings us, finally, to the fastest complete life cycle a Voynich solution has ever run. In May of 2019, the University of Bristol announced a breakthrough by one of its research associates. Gerard Cheshire, his doctorate recently completed, not, whatever the coverage implied, a trained historical linguist. His paper had appeared in a peer-reviewed journal, Romance Studies, and its claim was this: the manuscript is written in Proto-Romance, a lost, unwritten mother tongue of the Romance languages, surviving nowhere else on earth, set down in a calligraphic alphabet without punctuation. It is a compendium of remedies and therapeutic advice. It was compiled by a Dominican nun for Maria of Castile, Queen of Aragon. And the essential crack, Cheshire reported, had taken him about 2 weeks. 2 weeks for the book that had swallowed the freedmen's decades. The press release went out in mid-May. The headlines were global within hours. The retraction very nearly beat them. Linguists and medievalists objected at once, in public and in numbers, and within a day, perhaps two, the University of Bristol removed the story and stepped away from its own announcement. In a statement worth hearing in its full institutional voice, following media coverage, concerns have been raised about the validity of this research from academics in the fields of linguistics and medieval studies. We have therefore removed the story to seek further validation. From breakthrough to further validation in roughly one news cycle. Davis, once again at the door, was less institutional. Sorry folks, proto-Romance language is not a thing. This is just more aspirational, circular, self-fulfilling nonsense. And she did the work. She took Cheshire's substitutions and applied them herself. When you apply his Roman letter substitutions and then try to translate the result, you have no choice but to be subjective. It's gibberish. It's gibberish. The methodology falls apart. The premise itself, a single lost ancestor of the Romance languages, unwritten everywhere and always, except once, in this one book, has no standing in historical linguistics. The paper remains, technically, published. Step back and look at the parade whole. An amateur with a key that made broken Latin. A Yale philosopher with a forgery he could read. A linguist with 10 careful words that dissolved under a patient eye. A television writer with 2 lines and a missing index. A research associate with a language that never existed. Different decades, different trainings, different temperaments, one shape. The meaning assumed first. The method elastic enough to deliver it. The certainty, always, always the certainty. And across the table each time, doing the unglamorous arithmetic, a small standing committee of the unpersuaded. Davis, Pelling, Zandbergen, whose reward for being right over and over is to be introduced in every article as the skeptics, as though doubt were the eccentric position here. One claimant remains, and it is the one our own decade believes in. By the calendar, it belongs in the middle of this chapter. Its headlines came in January 2018 between the television writer and the research associate. But it deserves a room of its own because it is not really the story of one more solver. It is the story of the solver everyone now assumes will finish the job eventually. The machine. In the last week of January 2018, the mystery was solved again. Artificial intelligence, the headline said, in a dozen wordings, across a dozen countries, had decoded the Voynich Manuscript, and the manuscript was Hebrew. The story underneath was real and considerably more careful than the coverage. It had also been published quietly and properly 2 years earlier. Bradley Hauer and Greg Kondrak, computational linguists at the University of Alberta, were not Voynich hunters by trade. In 2016, in the Transactions of the Association for Computational Linguistics, they published a method for a genuinely hard problem, given a text in an unknown script, possibly scrambled. Determine what language lies underneath. They trained their system on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, one of the most translated documents on Earth, in 380 languages. On test material, it identified the source language 97% of the time. A serious tool, seriously built. Then they aimed it at the one text every method like this eventually gets aimed at. Out of 380 candidates, the top match, Hebrew. Their hypothesis, offered as a hypothesis, was that each Voynich word might be a Hebrew word with its letters sorted into alphabetical order, a so-called alphagram, and its vowels dropped. Undo those operations, and you get something Hebrew-shaped. The team could not find a Hebrew scholar to evaluate the output. That detail deserves a moment, so they did what our century does. They put it through Google Translate. The first line they tried came back as, "She made recommendations to the priest, man of the house, and me and people." Kondrak was honest about it in a way headlines cannot metabolize. Over 80% of the words were in a Hebrew dictionary, he said, but we didn't know if they made sense together. To their credit, the paper claims nothing it cannot hold. Its own conclusion allows that the results could be tantalizing clues, or simply artifacts of the combinatorial power of anagramming and language models. The scientists reported a lead. The headlines reported a solution. The specialists, well drilled by now, reported the problems within days. A language identification system has no way to answer none of the above. Hand it anything, hand it noise, and it will still rank its 380 candidates and crown the least bad fit. Google Translate is an engine built to wring plausible sentences out of broken input. Its cooperation proves nothing, a point the medievalist Damien Fleming pressed, along with its deeper cousin, the Hebrew. The machine knows is modern Hebrew, not the language of the manuscript's own centuries. And René Zandbergen, keeper of the field's reference archive, added the quiet technical objections. Voynichese uses roughly 35 symbols to Hebrew's 22 letters, and the statistical match pointed at one of the manuscript's two dialects, while the page they translated was written in the other. It would be easy to file all this as one more float in the parade, but the machines deserve a more precise verdict, because their failure here is structural, and the structure is worth understanding in a decade that quietly assumes there is no text a large enough model cannot eventually read. Start with what every successful decipherment in history has rested on: an anchor, a parallel text in a known language, a Rosetta Stone, or a known language hiding behind an unknown script, or, at minimum, a proper name that must be where it is, the crutch backs reached for. Remember Kirker, at the very beginning of our story, certain he had read the hieroglyphs, fluent and celebrated, and wrong for 200 years. What finally read Egyptian was not a greater genius. It was an anchor, the same decree carved once in a script no one could read and once in a script anyone could. Machine learning amplifies anchors. It does not create them, and the Voynich offers none. An unknown script over an unknown language, if it is a language at all, with not one word confirmed in 4 centuries. Then the category. Every tool assumes what kind of thing it is solving. A cipher solver assumes a cipher. A language identifier assumes a language. And the entire lesson of this manuscript, paid for across 100 years, is that the category itself is the mystery. Language, cipher, or nothing aim a tool at the wrong category, and it does not return an error. It returns Hebrew. Then the size. The manuscript holds some 38,000 words, by machine standards, a pamphlet. The language models of our decade learn from trillions of words. Against a corpus this small, statistical learning has almost nothing to grip, and the patterns it finds are as likely to be echoes of its own power as properties of the text. The Alberta paper, to its lasting credit, said as much about itself. And then there is the trap our own moment has built. Ask a modern large language model to translate a page of the Voynich manuscript. It will not hesitate, and it will not fail. It will return fluent, confident, period-appropriate prose, herbal recipes, remedies, star lore, whatever the drawings suggest, And if you ask again tomorrow, it will return different, fluent, confident prose with equal serenity. The field's word for this is hallucination, confidence generated with nothing beneath it. These systems are engines of plausibility, trained to continue, to satisfy, to produce the answer-shaped thing. Against a 600-year-old object whose entire power is that it is answer-shaped and possibly empty, that is not a codebreaker. That is Professor Newbold again. The intense enthusiasm, the ingenious subconscious, at scale, with perfect grammar, infinite stamina, and no colleague named Manley coming to check the ink. The one sentence the machine cannot say is the only sentence a century of failure has actually earned. This may say nothing, and I cannot tell. So the machines join the codebreakers, honorably enough, in the long tradition of measuring the text ever more finely and reading none of it. Language, cipher, or hoax, 3 doors, still locked, and the newest keys melt in the locks like all the others. But a locked book is not a silent one. If we cannot ask what it says, there is an older question, and the object has been answering it this whole time, in its skins and its pigments, its stitching and its stars, and the 5 distinct sets of handwriting moving through its pages. Somebody made this thing. In the early 15th century, over months, with skill, at cost, on purpose. We cannot yet read a word of theirs. We can still go looking for them. For more than 100 years, we have been interrogating the message. A famous professor staked his reputation on it and lost. The codebreakers of 2 world wars walked away empty-handed. The machines took their turn and failed in new ways. The text has not yielded one sentence. So we do what investigators have always done when a message will not break. We stop asking what it says. We start asking who sent it. It is not a hopeless question. We know within a window of about 34 years when the calves lived whose skins became these pages. We know, roughly, what corner of the world it came from. And we have a lineup, a century of suspects, some of them famous, some with no names at all. Who could actually have done this? The first name ever attached to the book is also the grandest. Roger Bacon, 13th century Franciscan friar of Oxford, Dr. Mirabilis, the wonderful teacher, who wrote of gunpowder and optics and flying machines, and who became, in the legend that grew up around him, a magician. If any medieval mind could have produced an unreadable book of secret science, surely it was his. Where does the attribution come from? One sentence. In the letter that accompanied the manuscript to Rome in 1665, a letter we will read closely in the next chapter. An aging Prague physician passes along something he was once told, that the book was believed to be the work of Roger Bacon, the Englishman. And he adds in the same breath, "On this point, I suspend judgment." Almost no one downstream suspended judgment. Wilfred Voynich certainly did not. He presented his find to the world as the Roger Bacon cipher manuscript. And in 1921, the philosopher William Romain Newbold announced that Bacon's authorship was proven and his microscope recovered. We watch that edifice come down in Chapter 7. But set Newbold aside, because the deeper problem with Roger Bacon is arithmetic. Bacon died in 1292. The vellum of this book dates with 95% probability to the years between 1404 and 1438. Radiocarbon dating has a useful asymmetry. It dates the death of the animal, not the writing. A later hand can always, in principle, write on old skin. But no hand, however gifted, can write on the skin of a calf that has not yet been born. The error only runs one way. That loophole will matter for other suspects. For Bacon, the door is simply locked. He had been dead for well over a century when this parchment was made. At the far edge of the window, nearly a century and a half. No serious researcher today treats Bacon as the author. The most anyone will still argue, the cipher historian Nick Pelling has made this case, is that the book may once have been sold as a Roger Bacon manuscript around the year 1600 to a buyer who badly wanted it to be one, which is a claim about the sales pitch, not about the author. The second theory keeps the emperor and upgrades the Khan. John Dee, mathematician, philosopher, court astrologer to Elizabeth I, the most learned magus in England. At his side, Edward Kelly, his scryer, who gazed into the crystal and dictated the speech of angels, and, before that career, a documented forger. Together they had produced an entire invented angelic language, Enochian. And they were physically there. Through the 1580s, the pair moved through Bohemia in the orbit of Rudolf II, the emperor who collected wonders. The theory writes itself. Kelly, the professional deceiver, manufactures a book of beautiful gibberish. Dee, the sincere scholar, who really did own and champion Roger Bacon manuscripts, lends it a pedigree. The emperor pays 600 gold ducats for a relic of English magic. Motive means opportunity. It is a wonderful theory. You can still find it, at the time of this recording, on Yale's own catalog page, which calls it very likely. And it is almost certainly false. Two blows land on it. The first is the same arithmetic, running the other direction. Dee and Kelly operated in the 1580s. The vellum was made roughly 150 years earlier. The second blow is stranger. Follow the Dee legend backward through the sources, and it does not lead to the 17th century. It leads to 1921, to the same Philadelphia lecture in which Voynich conjured his castle full of chests. The researchers Raffel Prinke and René Zumbruggen have shown that Voynich assembled his cast of characters, in part, out of a historical novel, Dee's diaries, and Dee recorded everything, never mentioned selling any such book. The one diary entry believers cite 630 ducats, records Dee handing over money after his banishment from Prague, not receiving a fortune from an emperor. The Dee provenance is not a 17th century legend. It is a 20th century one, and we can name the man who started it. There remains the rescue argument. The loophole radiocarbon leaves open. Could Kelly have written his gibberish in the 1580s on genuinely old, blank vellum? Here, the physical evidence closes in. Multispectral imaging shows these pages are not a palimpsest, never scraped, never washed, never written on before, where real forged codices are almost always built on recycled leaves. Kelly would have needed clean, unused calfskin for some 240 pages, 14 or 15 whole skins, seemingly from a single batch, a century and a half old, matching foldouts included. The historian Eamon Duffy has a word for the idea that such a supply sat blank and waiting through 2 centuries. Inconceivable. The ink and pigments are period appropriate throughout, nothing modern in them, with the honest caveat that chemistry alone cannot fix the moment the ink went down. And the pictures, battlements, costume, herbal style, converge independently on the early 1400s. A forger in the 1580s would have had to counterfeit half a dozen kinds of evidence at once, for sciences that would not exist for 3 more centuries. Duffy's verdict speaks for the field. The radiocarbon result effectively rules out any possibility that the manuscript is a post-medieval forgery. Notice what those 2 dead theories have in common: famous names. When a book is this strange, something in us insists on an author of matching celebrity. But the evidence has been tugging the other way the whole time, away from the great men toward someone quieter. The real question is not which famous man wrote it. It is what kind of person inside that 34-year window would have made a book like this. Start with what the book actually shows. Half of it is plants. A long stretch of it is stars. And one gathering, Choir 13, the strangest 20 pages, is women, dozens of them, standing in pools, joined by pipes. In 2024, for the first time in a long while, a reading of those pages passed peer review. Keegan Brewer and Michelle Lewis, writing in the journal Social History of Medicine, argued that parts of the manuscript concerned sex, conception, and gynecology. The territory late medieval writers called women's secrets. Understand what this claim is not. It is not a decipherment. Brewer and Lewis do not claim to read a single word. It is an argument about the book's subject, from its pictures and from historical context. And the context is the striking part. There was a real physician, Johannes Hartlieb, Bavarian, born around 1410, dead in 1468, his working life almost exactly inside our window, who wrote on women's medicine, and who explicitly recommended that the most dangerous recipes, those for contraception and abortion, be written in cipher, so the wrong readers could never use them. That was no rhetorical flourish. Brewer and Lewis found, and decoded, a real enciphered recipe of the period. 21 lines, Northern Italian, gynecological. Medical knowledge deliberately locked behind cipher in exactly this era, in exactly this part of Europe, is not a theory. It was a practice. The caveats are real. The same nude figures do very different work elsewhere in the book, ringing the zodiac wheels, each holding a star, which looks cosmological, not clinical. The imagery is far too fantastical to serve as a usable manual of anything. Even the famous green pools carry a warning. The green was painted on later, over an original blue that had faded, a later owner's retouching, and a caution against reading too much into any color here. As for a female author, that is 2 steps of guesswork stacked on a book no one can read, and Brewer and Lewis carefully claim the subject and go no further. When a claimant in 2017 tried to inflate a women's health reading into a full decipherment, it collapsed within days. We watched it fall in the parade. The honest frame is this: a plausible subject, an unproven manual, an unknowable author. Then there is the question of where, and here the book testifies against itself. On the great 9-circle fold-out stands a little castle, and its battlements are drawn with swallowtail merlons. The V-notched fortifications of northern Italy, the signature of the country around Verona. Art historians place the costumes of the zodiac figures in the mid-15th century. Yet the margins carry traces of German in hands of the mid-1400s, and the Sagittarius is drawn as a crossbowman in the Central European fashion. Italian walls, German notes. The compromise reading, the one René Zandbergen prefers, is Alpine, the arc where the Italian and German worlds meet. And the impossible plants have relatives. Sergio Torresella, the historian of Italian herbals, placed them within a real genre, the so-called alchemical herbals of northern Italy, some 70 surviving manuscripts, most from the Veneto, full of fantastical, composite, invented plants. The Voynich Manuscript is stranger than every one of them. But it is recognizably kin. Picture, then, an early 15th century workshop somewhere along that Alpine arc, fluent in the culture of herbal and medical books. Has anyone put a name at that address? One serious attempt. Pelling has argued for Antonio Avellino, called Filarete, the architect working in Milan, a writer of little books of secrets, documented as interested in cipher. It is the best argued named suspect in the literature. It is unproven, and Pelling himself concedes that his preferred dates run slightly late against the vellum. And the geography is softer than it sounds. Battlements travel with the artists who draw them, and the plants are mostly unidentifiable, which cuts against any working herbal at all. But the last finding is the one that reframes the entire question, because it dissolves the premise every theory so far has shared: the lone author. In 2020, the paleographer Lisa Fagan Davis studied the handwriting itself and found not one scribe, but five distinct hands. And her findings snapped onto a 40-year-old mystery, the two statistical dialects of Voynichese we met in Chapter 6. Scribes 1 and 4 wrote language A. Scribes 2, 3, and 5 wrote language B. No scribe wrote both. 5 people, all trained to write fluently at speed without corrections, a script that exists nowhere else on earth. That is not a lone eccentric filling the dark with symbols. That is a team, a workshop, or a small community, which deepens the mystery even as it narrows it. One person writing nonsense needs no explanation beyond himself. 5 people writing the same nonsense in 2 consistent dialects need training. They need a reason. So here is where a century of suspicion has landed. The famous names are gone. Bacon dead too early, Dee and Kelly born too late, every celebrity theory undone by a strip of calfskin. What serious scholars still find credible is almost defiantly unglamorous. A team of anonymous scribes, 5 hands, working somewhere on the Italian-German arc of the Alps in the early 1400s, inside a genuine tradition of herbal and medical bookmaking, plausibly recording knowledge someone wanted guarded, possibly the kind Hartleaf said should never be written plain, people with no names at all. The book withholds its words. It withholds its makers too. But if we cannot name them, we can do the next best thing. We can follow the book itself, out of their hands and down 6 centuries, owner to owner, letter to letter, through an erased signature and a rumor of an emperor's gold, all the way to a vault in New Haven. That trail is made of documents, of hearsay, and of one ghost raised by ultraviolet light. It is time to walk the chain of hands. A book does not survive 600 years by accident. It survives because, in every generation, someone chooses to keep it, shelves it, hides it, sells it, hands it on. The makers of this book left no names, but the book kept a record of another kind, the marks, the letters, and the rumors of everyone who held it afterward. That record is the closest thing it has to a biography. Some of its links are documents you can touch. One is a story no one can verify, and between them lie 2 great silences. Walk it forward. It begins with silence. The calves whose skins became these pages died sometime between 1404 and 1438. And then nothing. For roughly 160 years, the book vanishes from history. No owner, no shelf mark, no letter, not one mention that anyone has found. A book 5 scribes labored over drops out of the world for the better part of 2 centuries. A single clue survives from those lost years. At some point, an early hand wrote the names of the months into the zodiac pages in a dialect of French from the north, or the Occitan-speaking country, a whisper of travel. We cannot follow it anywhere. When the book steps back into the light, around the year 1600, it is in Prague. And Prague around 1600 is exactly where a book like this belongs. Rudolph II, the melancholy Holy Roman Emperor, had made his capital a court of wonders, a payroll of astronomers and alchemists, a magnet for anyone in Europe with something strange to sell. If an unreadable book of impossible plants was going to surface anywhere, it would surface here. And we can prove that it did, not from a story, but from the book's own first page. Look at folio unread at the bottom margin. To the naked eye, there is almost nothing there because someone, at some point, scrubbed it nearly clean. Around 1914, Wilfred Voynich, suspecting a ghost, applied a chemical reagent to raise it. An intervention that damaged the page, and one no conservator would forgive today. But under ultraviolet light, the ghost stands up. A signature, Jakob J. A. Tepinets. Jakob Porchitsky, Latinized as Jacobus Sinapius, was Rudolph II's imperial distiller, the director of his botanical gardens, and his personal physician. In 1608, the emperor ennobled him, and he took the title de Tepinès. He signed this book with that title, meaning he signed it after 1608, and he died in 1622. There it is, the first hard evidence of ownership in the book's existence. The manuscript inside Rudolph's court circle, in the hands of the emperor's own herbalist, sometime between 1608 and 1622. Honesty requires 2 footnotes. One researcher, comparing the page against an authenticated Sinapius signature, has questioned whether the hands match. A minority view, the mainstream reading is genuine but scrubbed. And that is the second footnote. Someone tried to erase it. Who and why? A later owner effacing an old claim, or a seller improving his merchandise? The page does not say. Even the book's receipts keep secrets. An owner at court, though, is not the emperor. Did Rudolph himself possess it? Here comes the famous story, the one that nearly every telling of this manuscript states as fact, and this one will not. The story says Rudolph bought the book for 600 gold ducats. Its entire foundation is one sentence in one letter, written in 1665, a letter we are about to read. The writer, an old man, reports what a friend once told him, that Dr. Raphael Menischowski, lawyer, cryptographer, tutor to the young King Ferdinand, said the book had belonged to the Emperor Rudolph, who paid its bearer 600 ducats, and who believed it the work of Roger Bacon. And the writer immediately adds, "On this point I suspend judgment." Now, do the arithmetic on that sentence. Menischowski died in 1644, more than 20 years before the letter that reports him. By the time the story was written down, its source was 2 decades dead, and the emperor half a century gone. It is a memory of a dead man's anecdote, and nothing corroborates it. Rudolph's court inventories survive, and the book cannot be found in them. The nearest echo in any archive is a record from 1599, a lot of unusual books sold to Rudolph's court by an Augsburg collector named Karl Wiedemann for 600 gulden. Tantalizing. The record names no titles. So the honest status of the emperor's 600 ducats is this, hearsay. Plausible, resonant, and undocumented. The scrubbed signature of his herbalist is a fact. The gold is a story. The next holder you have already met. Georg Berisch, the Prague alchemist whose 1639 letter to Athanasius Kircher opened this film. The man who called the book his Riddle of the Sphinx, studied it for decades and died around 1662, having read none of it. His library passed to his friend Johannes Marcus Marzi, physician, rector of the University of Prague, and a correspondent of Kircher's for nearly 30 years. Martzi was near the end of his own life, and he did with the book the one thing left to do. He sent it, the book itself this time, not hand-copied samples, to Rome, to Kircher, the Jesuit who was believed to read all languages. With it went a Latin cover letter, dated at Prague the 19th of August, 1665, though the last digit of the year is written ambiguously enough that Yale's catalog long read it as 1666. One document, one stroke of the pen, two readings. The letter survives, and it has never left the book. It crossed to Rome with it, hid with it, crossed the Atlantic with it, and sits beside it today under its own shelf mark. In it, Martzi writes, "This book, bequeathed to me by an intimate friend, I destined for you, my very dear Athanasius, as soon as it came into my possession, for I was convinced it could be read by no one except yourself. It is the sheet of paper on which 3 centuries of legend were built, the Rudolf hearsay, the Bacon guess, the suspended judgment." And it closes with a flourish. Such sphinxes as these obey no one but their master Kircher. The master never answered the riddle. Kircher, who cleaned the hieroglyphs, who published torrents on every subject, is not known to have written another word about it. The book entered the library of the Collegio Romano, and history very nearly lost it a second time. It cannot even be identified in the 1678 catalog of Kircher's own museum. For nearly 2.5 centuries, the trail goes institutional and silent, no named owner, no item-level record, nothing. The book survived the suppression of the Jesuit order in 1773. It survived the new Italian state's seizure of the religious libraries. The Collegio Romano's was confiscated in 1873 because the Jesuits hid part of their collection, moving it quietly to villas outside Rome. Some 245 years in the dark. How it came out of the dark, you already know. In 1912, Chapter 1, a bookseller with a secret bought it from the Jesuits in a sale so discreet he was obliged to invent a castle to cover it. Even then, the book resisted being owned. Voynich spent the last 18 years of his life promoting it, certain it would make his fortune. It never sold. He died in New York in 1930, and his will split the manuscript, 60% to his widow, Ethel, 40% to Ann Nill, the loyal manager of his business. Through the Depression, no buyer. Ethel died in 1960, her share passing, the probate files show, not to Nill, but to her friend Winifred Gay. And on the 12th of July, 1961, Ann Nill sold the unsellable book to Hans P. Kross, the formidable New York rare book dealer, for $24,500 in cash. Kross understood exactly what he had bought, a lottery ticket. Deciphered, the book would be beyond price. He asked $100,000, then $160,000. And for 8 years, nobody paid. The manuscript, an emperor was rumored to have bought for a fortune, could not find a single buyer in the 20th century. So in 1969, Kross gave it away, donated it to Yale University's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. Worn down, he said, by the endless procession of scholars and would-be decipherers at his door, helped along, the records suggest, by a tax law that made that December the last good moment for such a gift. Yale cataloged it in the flattest possible prose, Beinecke MS 408. Martzi's letter, still faithful after 300 years, became MS 408A. It has not moved since. Now stand back and look at the whole chain at once, because it has a shape. Baresh looked into the book and saw medicine, ancient chemical wisdom worth wringing out. Minishovsky's tale made it an emperor's treasure and an English wizard's masterpiece. Marzi saw one last gift for a brilliant friend. Kircher received one more Sphinx to master and set it aside. The Jesuits saw property worth hiding. Voynich saw Roger Bacon's cipher and his own name beside it in history. K. Rao SS saw an investment waiting on a decipherment that never came. And Yale saw a research object to be scanned, cataloged, guarded. 6 centuries, a dozen keepers, and not one of them ever read a sentence of it. Every hand it passed through held it up to the light and saw, in its silence, exactly what that holder most wanted to find. Hold on to that pattern, because it does not stop with the owners. Whole eras have done the same thing. The age of science, the age of the codebreakers, the age of thinking machines, each one certain the book was speaking directly to it. The chain of hands is only the small version of the story. The book, it turns out, is a mirror. It is time to look into it. The book stopped moving in 1969. Since the day Hans K. gave up trying to sell it and gave it to Yale instead, it has not changed hands or crossed a border or vanished into anyone's locked chest. 5.5 centuries of wandering. Prague, Rome, the hidden villa, the dealer's safe, ended in a climate-controlled vault in New Haven. The chain of hands is closed. But there is a second chain, and that one has never closed. It is the chain of readings, the long procession of minds that have leaned over these pages and decided what they must be. Lay those readings out in order, decade by decade, and a pattern appears. It is not a pattern about the manuscript. It is a pattern about us. Consider what each age has seen in it. In the 1920s, a century newly dazzled by its own instruments, the microscope, the telescope, the laboratory, looked into the book and saw the birth of science. William Romain Newbold announced that it was Roger Bacon's secret notebook, proof that a 13th century friar had built microscopes and telescopes hundreds of years before their time and hidden the discovery in strokes of ink too small for the naked eye. It was precisely the past that a scientific age wanted for itself, a martyr of reason, encoded, waiting to be vindicated. The ink cracks, as we saw, said otherwise. Then came the wars, and after them the long cold one, and a different kind of mind took up the book. To the codebreakers, nothing unread was innocent. They lived in a world where every silence was presumed to be a transmission, where the fate of navies had turned on strings of letters exactly this meaningless looking, and so to them, the manuscript was obviously a cipher, because in their world, everything was. William Friedman came at it 3 times across 40 years, with a study group of demobilizing Army cryptanalysts punching the entire text onto IBM cards in 1944, and again in 1962, preparing the text for an RCA computer. And in the end he sealed his verdict inside an anagram, like a man locking a bet in a drawer. His wife Elizabeth, a great codebreaker in her own right, wrote in 1962 that the confident substitution readings still arriving every year were doomed to utter frustration. The age of secrets looked into the book and saw an enemy message. It never broke. Then the age of secrets gave way to the age of sharing, and the book acquired a mailing list. In December of 1991, before most of the world had heard the word Internet, a small electronic list started up at rand.org, begun by 2 cryptologists named Jim Gillogly and Reeds, and for 2 decades it was the entire field's living room. Around 1998, René Zandbergen and Gabriel Landini built EVA, an alphabet that maps each impossible glyph onto a look-alike Latin letter, so that for the first time in its existence the book could be typed. In 2004, Yale put high-resolution scans online, free, for anyone. and the crowd came. A forum carries the conversation today, thousands of members, more than 80,000 posts, and by Yale's own account, roughly half of all traffic to the Voynichese online page viewer is people staring at this one book. The age of the crowd looked into it and saw the perfect distributed puzzle, the problem no million eyes could fail to solve. It remains unsolved. And then our own age arrived and did what our age does. It looked into the book and saw a benchmark. In 2018, researchers at the University of Alberta ran the text through an algorithm trained to identify 380 languages, and the headlines announced that artificial intelligence had found the answer, Hebrew, in anagrams. The first decoded sentence, passed through a translator, came out as incoherent as everything that had come before, and the researchers themselves were careful to call the result a demonstration of a method, not a translation. Larger machines have done no better, though they fail more fluently. Ask a modern language model to read Voynichese, and it will happily produce a confident, graceful, entirely invented translation, doing at scale, in seconds, what Newbold did with a magnifying glass over years, generating precisely the reading you were hoping to find. 4 ages. 4 reflections. Bacon's lost science, the unbreakable cipher, the crowd-sourced puzzle, the ultimate test set. Each generation carried its proudest instrument into the vault, and each verdict, in hindsight, describes the instrument better than it describes the book. That is what the manuscript is, culturally, whatever it turns out to be textually. It is a mirror. It shows every era the thing that era most believes in, and it has confirmed none of them. The artist may have understood this before the scientist did. In 1981, an Italian artist and designer named Luigi Serafini published the Codex Serafinianus, an illustrated encyclopedia of an imaginary world, rendered in loving, hallucinatory detail, written in a flowing, invented script. It is universally called the Voynichese spiritual successor, and the family resemblance is real. But there is one difference between the two books, and it is the telling one. Serafini has confirmed that his script means nothing. We know, and because we know, the Codex Serafinianus resolves into an artwork, a beautiful meditation on meaninglessness, complete. The Voynichese status is genuinely unknown. That gap between confirmed nonsense and possible sense is the entire distance between an art object and an abyss. Umberto Eco understood it too. In the fall of 2013, the author of The Name of the Rose visited the Voynichese, a library that owns a Gutenberg Bible, and of all its treasures, there was one book he asked to see. The great scholar of signs, a man who spent his career on texts that permit endless interpretation, standing over the one book on earth that permits nothing else. And beneath the high culture runs the wide culture, where the book has quietly become a modern myth. In the novels, it always means something. Deborah Harkness built her Discovery of Witches around a lost, enchanted manuscript modeled on this one, and then, in a loop that fiction could not have planned, went on to write the introduction to Yale's own facsimile of the real thing. Lev Grossman's Codex turned on a medieval book that might be an elaborate fraud. Indiana Jones stole the manuscript from Yale and followed it like a map toward the Philosopher's Stone. A children's series sent its young heroes into the Voynichese to steal it again. In the games, it always unlocks something. Its scattered pages in Assassin's Creed are the writings of a vanished precursor race. In Broken Sword, it encodes a power that a cult will kill to control. The webcomic XKCD proposed, in a single panel, that it was the campaign notes for a 15th century role-playing game, a joke, and also, if you squint, one more confident solution. There is a manga named for it. When the Voynich turned 50, the library commissioned music from the manuscript, a composition by Stephen Gorbos, premiered by the vocal ensemble Roomful of Teeth. The book sung, since it cannot be said. And in 2016, Yale University Press published a full photographic facsimile, betting that ordinary readers would pay real money for an exact copy of a book that no one on earth can read. The bet paid. Notice the pattern running through all of it. In every novel, every game, every retelling, the manuscript means something: a map, a key, a power, a lost world. Fiction cannot tolerate the one possibility that reality insists on keeping open, that it may mean nothing at all. Every storyteller who touches it does exactly what Newbold did, what Friedman did, what the algorithms do now. They fill the silence. Lisa Fagan Davis, the scholar who has debunked more claimed solutions than perhaps anyone alive, once put her finger on the engine underneath it all. Everyone wants to be the one to prove it, to crack it, to prove you're smarter. The mirror, in other words, is not only generational, it is personal. Anyone who looks at these pages for more than a minute begins, helplessly, to see a shape in them. The book has collected a century of our reflections, the Bacons, the ciphers, the puzzles, the benchmarks, and filed every one of them away and given back nothing. And yet, beneath all of the projection, there is still a real question with real stakes. Is there anything in there at all? In our own time, that question is sharpened into something like a formal standoff. Two camps of serious scientists, working from the same statistics, arriving at opposite verdicts with nothing able to referee between them. That standoff is where this story has to end, because it may be the closest thing to an answer the book will ever give. Strip everything else away now. The castle and the ducats, the emperor, the professor, the codebreakers, the witches, and the video games, the whole century of reflections. What actually remains on the table at the end of the night is two scientific papers and the space between them. The first appeared in 2013. Marcello Montemurro and Damien Zanetti, two physicists, did something no would-be translator had thought to do. They ignored what the words might mean and measured how they behave across the whole length of the book. Because in genuine language, meaning leaves a statistical wake. Content words cluster where their subject lives. A word like root haunts the chapters about plants. And that is what they found. The manuscript's most informative words gather in topically coherent sections. The vocabulary of the herbal pages and the pharmaceutical pages overlaps, just as their illustrations do. The information peaks at the scale of a few hundred words, the same scale where real languages carry their structure. Their conclusion, in the paper's own words, this organization limits severely the scope of the hoax hypothesis. At the scale of the whole document, the book behaves like something that is about things. The second appeared 6 years later. Torsten Tim and Andreas Schinner proposed a method they called self-citation, and it is almost insultingly simple. To write the next word, the scribe glances at a word he has already written, a line or two above, copies it, and changes it slightly. Then again, 38,000 times. No cipher wheel, no tables, no device at all. A quill, a habit, and patience. Nothing that could not have existed in 1420. And when Tim and Schinner generated text this way, the output reproduced the manuscript's fingerprint, both of ZIF's laws, the low entropy, the binomial word lengths, the stuttering rows of near identical words. the very structure Montemurro read as the signature of meaning, produced by a habit that means nothing at all, meaningless by construction. There it is, the same text, two legitimate, peer-reviewed analyses. One concludes the statistics point toward meaning, the other manufactures those statistics out of emptiness. And the uncomfortable truth, the truth this whole century of failure has been circling, is that statistics cannot referee between them. A measurement can tell you a text is ordered. It cannot tell you whether the order was carrying a thought. At the beginning of tonight, we made a promise. 3 doors, a real language hidden behind a cipher, a language that never existed anywhere else, or a beautiful emptiness, and the strange admission that we cannot rule a single one of them out. Now you can see why. It comes down to the anomaly we met hours ago, the abnormally low entropy of the text, each character too predictable from the one before it, the writing more ordered than writing is supposed to be. Hold that fact up to each door. A cipher? Encipherment scrambles. It makes text less predictable, not more. The fact jams the lock. An invented language? A tongue built from rigid slots, prefix, root, suffix, would produce exactly this order. That was Friedman's sealed verdict, an artificial language of the a priori type. The fact fits perfectly, and still the door does not open. No one, in 100 years, has turned that idea into a single readable sentence, and no such scheme is known to history until 2 centuries after the vellum was made. A hoax? A copying habit like Tim and Shinner's yields exactly this order, empty by design. The fact fits again, and against that door stands Montemurro's clustering and the sheer improbability of 5 scribes sustaining coherent, section-appropriate nonsense across 38,000 words and 2 distinct dialects. One fact. It fits every lock. It jams every lock. That is the entire mystery, stated as plainly as it can be stated. And it is why the honest answer to the question, when will it be solved, may be never. Every decipherment in history has needed an anchor, a fixed point outside the text against which a solution can be proved. The hieroglyphs of Egypt stood silent for 14 centuries until the Rosetta Stone offered the same decree in Greek. Linear B fell in the 1950s because beneath its signs lay a language scholars already knew, an archaic Greek, there to check every guess. An anchor is not a convenience. It is the only way to be wrong, and therefore the only way to be right. The Voynich has none. No bilingual page. No named author. No confirmed reading of even one line, which produces the cruelest scenario of all. Suppose someone, someday, truly solves it. The grammar real, the reading true. How would they prove it? A century of Newbolds has taught us that a sufficiently determined method will always produce a text. Without an anchor, a true solution and a beautiful delusion are indistinguishable from the outside. The manuscript is not just unread. It may be unreadable in principle, not because there is no answer, but because no answer could ever be verified. The people who know the book best say this in careful voices. The most authoritative linguistic survey of the manuscript concludes that the evidence leans, on balance, towards something derived from natural language, and, in the same breath, that all current language claims are clearly problematic. René Zandbergen, who has kept the field's records for decades, puts it with a caretaker's precision. The manuscript is certainly genuine. It remains possible that the text has no meaning. There are many arguments, and no solid proof, either way. Even our newest instruments deepen the picture rather than resolve it. In 2024, Multispectral imaging of the very first page revealed a hidden scrawl, an early reader's attempt at decryption, a substitution alphabet tried and abandoned because it produced nonsense. The oldest known attempt to read the book recovered by 21st century light. It failed too, and its ghost surrendered no key. Then turned to the very last page, where the book plays its final joke. Folio 116, verso the outermost leaf, carries a few faint lines that are not written in Voynichese at all. They are written, mostly, in ordinary Latin letters. An alphabet, you know, and even this cannot be read. Scholars call the scrawl Microscope, after what seems to be its first word. The writing leans toward German, toward Latin, and then dissolves under inspection. Someone, centuries ago, held this book and left a few parting words inside its cover. A charm, a recipe, a complaint, a key, no one knows. The book that cannot be read swallowed even its reader's note. Its last page is a portrait of its entire history, a human hand reaching toward it in a familiar alphabet and failing anyway. In 2013, in The New Yorker, the writer Reed Johnson arrived at the sentence, "This whole story has been walking toward." In an age when information is so readily available to us, he wrote, there's something important about a book that can't be read. It's sort of an island of inexplicability in the midst of a life in which everything is resolved. And he named the paradox underneath it, the one that nobody in the long parade of solvers ever says out loud. A decoded Voynich would remain a disappointment for being closed off, completed for being, in the end, no longer a mystery. Sit with that, because it is the quiet truth beneath 400 years of effort. Berchy called this book a riddle of the Sphinx. He was wrong in one particular. The Sphinx's riddle had an answer, and when the answer finally came, the Sphinx was destroyed by it. Whatever this book is, it has outlived every answer ever brought to it. And we have been, all of us, strangely relieved each time. Perhaps that will change. A letter in some Jesuit archive naming the workshop that made it, a second manuscript in the same script, miscatalogued on a shelf no one has checked. An anchor could still surface, but no one is close, and no one has ever been close. The greatest code breakers of the 20th century, the assembled crowd of the internet, and the largest machines ever built have all leaned over these pages, and every one of them came away holding a reflection. Tonight, in New Haven, the library is dark. The book is in its box, the box in its vault, and it is exactly what it was in Barish's study 4 centuries ago, a locked door, patient, taking up space. Every hand that has ever held it, the alchemist, the bookseller, the professor, the codebreakers, the crowd, has told a story to fill its silence. Tonight, so have we. And this, in the end, is why we keep it, why we fund the vault and photograph the pages and return, generation after generation, to a book that gives nothing back. Not because we are close to reading it. We are not. But every other question gives way now. Every other door opens in seconds. And somewhere along the way, without ever quite saying so, we discovered that we need one thing left that we cannot have. One island the flood of answers never reaches. The book knows nothing of this. It lies in the dark, as it has for 600 years, holding whatever it holds. It says nothing.